Ladies and gentlemen, ladies and gentlemen, we are about to begin role discussion with Agent Smith. Give me a moment. We're about to begin. If there are any new viewers who have not been around for this segment, this is a political and history-oriented time. I will continue to play StarCraft through it, and we are trying to focus on facts. We are not here to proselytize or tell you what to believe or what to think. We're here to talk about what happened and maybe guess at what will happen, that sort of thing. This is interactive, so if you have a question, you want to jump in, tag Moss Neotech Prototype in the chat. He'll pass it along, and then you can be a part of the conversation. This will be episode 47. These all go on YouTube. Let's rock, let's roll. This should go for around 2 to 3 hours, give or take. What is up, Agent Smith?
Oh, hello. How are you?
Absolutely fantastic. Aside from starting my day with the hangover.
Well, that can be uncomfortable.
Yeah, it was for my stomach and my head. But we recovered. I don't know if you saw the tweet, but yesterday's stream was one of those promoted ones, and we got above 10,000 viewers at one time.
Wow.
Yeah.
That's pretty awesome.
Isn't it?
Yeah. Bet you picked up a lot of subs, huh?
Yeah, sub is good. The main thing for those is follows, though, because you get a lot of first-time viewers who haven't seen your content before. Subscribing is usually if they're really excited about your channel and want to support you, versus if they've seen you for the first time, the follow is basically saying, I want to see you again, but I'm not going to give you my money yet.
Fair enough. That's good sense.
Yeah.
It's I guess you wouldn't call that a loss leader since it's not costing you anything per se, but I guess exposure would be the right word.
Yep. And we have, for the first time, a computer that can run a 1080p stream. Yesterday was the first stream where that happened. The PC was assembled Thursday and Friday, and I didn't stream.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's amazing. It's quiet. The video is way more crisp. The audio is better. And there's less background noise because it's a more quiet machine. I used to be hitting like a wall where I couldn't go any higher in the resolution or the bit rate, and I would get frame rate drops a little bit in StarCraft for the big battles, but now we can crank out max setting stream for Twitch and the computer is running at like 1% of its total power.
Wow.
Yeah.
Fancy business.
Mm-hmm.
That's a nice investment. You could write that off, probably.
Of course.
Business deduction.
It's for work. It's actually like the most crucial item for the job.
I would imagine it would be, given the nature of the work.
He's a bit quiet. I'll turn him up a little bit. Okay. So how was your week? We have Moss Neotech for questions.
I've been fine. It's been pretty quiet for me. I've just been plugging away at scripts and, doing this, that, and the other are side jobs. And kind of weird, a little up and down. I had a Chinese hot pot for the first time, so that was unique. Pretty tasty.
Yeah. I've had that a few times.
Well, does anything strike your fancy over the past week?
Well, there's always Trump plastered over the news for something he did or said. What did he do this time?
Well, I guess the main thing for the Trump administration was the declaration of emergency. So there was that. People have been talking about that quite a bit.
Oh, yeah. I saw Elizabeth Warren's tweet about it. She was saying that he abusing that is like really bad and full stop. I really don't like when people end a statement with full stop. It just seems really corny to me.
Well, they are politicians. That is kind of their bag. But yeah, it definitely is not a great precedent. It's problematic in a number of ways. I was kind of starting to wonder whether or not he would do it, because they eventually did reach a settlement on the shutdown, so there was kind of a compromise there. And I wasn't really sure when he would follow up with it or if he would. Kind of like what I was predicting he would in the last couple times we talked about it. And then he kind of sprang it after the fact, once it had kind of come out that there was a settlement and that he would allow the budget to go forward. See, I think we already talked about it a bit last week, kind of what the implications were, but I did have some more notes on it if I can find them. Ah, yeah, the significance of the declaration of emergency. So, if you've read the Lawfare article that we posted in chat last time, this is going to be pretty much old news to you, but just a quick sort of little summary from another article, another perspective. Technically, what he's doing is legal. There is sort of a legal basis for it, so it's not a completely arbitrary use of emergency powers. And it's not even necessarily the most far-reaching use of emergency powers that's happened over the past 10 years. So the precedent is not necessarily completely new. I think I did post an article on Twitter basically kind of going through this, so that if you want to read more about that aspect of it, you can kind of check that out. But the gist of it was that basically the bigger problem than the precedent being set and whether or not there's legitimate grounds to declare an emergency and whether or not he can actually use the specific emergency powers that he's trying to use as justification to build a wall on the border with Mexico. The bigger problem is sort of the nature in which the Trump administration is using the national emergency here. Generally, when past administrations have kind of bended the rules on declarations of emergency, they generally try to couch the declaration of emergency in terms that make it seem necessary or legal or something to that effect. There is at least a nominal attempt to pretend that it's a legitimate declaration of emergency. But in this case, the administration's usage is almost explicitly political, and that's kind of new. That does kind of break with an established norm. Again, previous administrations have been to that norm, and it's kind of been a trend towards breaking it with time, but the norm hasn't really been explicitly broken to this degree before, and that's kind of what's new. Democratic norms require discretionary powers to not be abused, and if they are abused, then there should be at least nominally a rationalization to make it seem apolitical, so that there is kind of at least a pretense there that upholds the broader democratic norms that hold up democratic society and political systems. So that's a difficult. That in itself is a bad precedent because that opens the door for future such abuses. It's also problematic because democratic norms are just hard to sustain in and of themselves because they require mutual recognition and observance by all political factions in a democratic society. And when one side breaks them for political benefit, it becomes very hard to restrain the other side or other opposing sides from doing the same. So there is a risk of a kind of escalatory spiral there going forward. And there's also, the courts themselves have been put in an awkward position because hypothetically, they could shoot down this declaration of emergency on technical grounds, on a technicality, basically. And, given some of the statements that the administration has made since the emergency was declared, there could well be legal grounds for scuppering it. But if they do, that's going to put a limit on emergency powers that the executive branch can use. And that could be a problem in the future if future executive branch well, I shouldn't say executive branch, if future presidents feel that power is constrained, if they want to use it, but maybe feel that they can't because of the precedent set by a court ruling now against the declaration of emergency. But then on the other hand, if the courts don't shoot it down, then again, you're kind of opening yourself up to some abuses. So kind of damned if they do, damned if they don't to a degree. Ideally, the final arbiter really here in cases of a national emergency that may or may not be abused kind of has to be Congress. The judicial branch, when it comes to national emergencies, has to defer to the executive branch, because national emergency is kind of a fuzzy term. It's kind of it's kind of ambiguous how you define an emergency. It's not really something you can easily write out very specifically in law. So in general, the executive branch has been given historically discretionary power in how to use that power. And the judiciary in turn depends on Congress to weigh in and try to restrain executive branches that might try to abuse that discretionary power. So ideally, Congress would step in and say, this is not really a legitimate state of emergency, so we're going to negate that, which technically they have the political power to do. They have the legal power to do. The president could veto that attempt, so then they would have to have a veto-proof majority, which in the United States requires, I believe, 2/3 of the House of Representatives and 2/3 of the Senate. And that's kind of a tall order given how much polarization there is in U.S. politics right now, but it's possible, it's hypothetically possible that there could be enough recognition among all sides of the political spectrum that this is a bridge too far. This is really a bit too much. You can easily argue that other things he's done, the Trump administration have done, have been too much, but that's all been debatable. This is different. This is kind of an issue that has to be addressed. And hypothetically, we could lean on the judicial system to handle it, but really, again, that creates some problems and is not a great precedent in and of itself. So it would really be much easier and better for the health of the overarching political environment, political ecosystem in the U.S. if Congress would just kind of shut it down here and try to address the problem of border security in another way, if indeed that it is felt to be a big issue like that, above and beyond what's already been agreed in the shutdown compromise. Obviously there was a certain amount of give and take there. I think I have notes on that too here somewhere. If I remember it. Yeah, it was $1.37 billion in funding for 55 miles of new fencing on the border. And in exchange, there would be a reduction in the number of beds in detention centers to 40,250 from the current 49,057. The idea there being that if there are fewer beds, then the administration would have to prioritize certain cases over others in terms of deporting detainees, or more accurately, in terms of arresting detainees. So you don't go after everybody who's in the U.S. illegally as an undocumented immigrant. You would kind of prioritize some cases, and I think the Democrats had in mind specifically undocumented immigrants who had committed crimes. So they would rather the administration focus on them, and restricting the amount of people that can be held at a given time is meant to kind of push them towards that. There was also more funding for quote-unquote border security, better technology, and increased screening at ports of entry. Basically, the compromise was more border fencing in exchange for fewer detention center beds. That was nominally the quid pro quo. And that was enough to kind of end the shutdown impasse. Now, if there is indeed a desire to do more on the border, that really should be addressed legislatively rather than through executive fiat. Again, it's not really unusual for an executive branch, or sorry, I should say for a president to, sort of creatively use, shall we say, executive power, redirecting funds from something it was intended to do to something else. That's kind of become more or less normal. It varies from from presidency to presidency, but over the past few decades, the executive branch has definitely become more and more powerful. That's a clear trend. So the real answer to that is the legislative branch kind of taking more action, reining it in, and doing a better job of exacting oversight over the executive branch. It's understandable that there's a desire to deal with important issues that kind of are difficult to address given the level of polarization, but leaning on executive branch runarounds is kind of a dangerous way to do that, at least over the long term. It, again, sets a bad precedent. So that's kind of an overarching problem here. That's kind of being brought to the fore by an unusually dramatic manifestation of it. So that's some quick commentary on that, and that's roughly where that is. There's going to be a whole court case about it. It's probably going to go to the Supreme Court, I would guess. So we'll be at plenty of courtroom drama about that. I don't know enough about it to know whether or not the administration will be able to go ahead with the construction, or if the courts will kind of put an injunction on them. I don't even know if you can put an injunction on a declaration of emergency like that. Somebody with a stronger legal background might know more about than I do. But that would, if anybody knows the answer to that, please do type that out in chat. This might be a good time for the usual disclaimer then. I'm not an expert in everything I talk about. I have a stronger background in some topics than others, probably most topics than others, given the range of what we talk about here. So chat is definitely encouraged to participate. If I say anything that's wrong, biased, etc., chat is definitely encouraged to chip in and correct me if I'm wrong. I want to know more than anybody. I don't read chat while we do this, but I will read it afterwards, so I will see it eventually. But chat's participation is definitely encouraged and appreciated. I learn a lot from these too. So that said, was there anything else that you thought was interesting the past week, Neuro?
Not really. I didn't check news too much.
Okay. We've got questions piling up, so I'll get to them here in just a second. But there was one thing I wanted to point out, which is that I kind of fluffed on Article 11 and Article 13. We were talking a bit about that last week. That's the European Union's proposed laws that would impact websites that have a lot of content posted to them, and would also impact news aggregator websites. So that's kind of the meme regulation law that people have been talking about in Europe, especially. I had said last week that there was an impasse and they probably wouldn't vote on it until after EU Parliament elections, but it looks like that's not actually true. It looks like there was a compromise reached and there's going to be a vote much sooner. So we could see that in the next month or two. Pretty quick here. So I missed that. I got the declaration of emergency right, but I didn't predict that one right. So I'm kind of even for the past week. We could talk about that a little later because I did have some stuff on that, but I'll just jump into questions here since they're kind of piling up. Let's see. So my tweets I'll start with illustrates comments on or discusses. Should this be interpreted as a secret code in case his account gets hacked? I don't think it would be a very good secret code because then it could be easily emulated. No, it's no secret code. I'm just not very creative with how I headline those. It was I used to just post the articles, but it was recommended to me. I don't remember by who, but it was recommended to me that I kind of just add like a little descriptor to each of the Twitter posts. So I wasn't really sure how to do that, so I just kind of briefly started writing little outlines of what was in the article or what I thought was interesting in the articles.
That was me, I think.
Was it you? Okay.
Yeah.
But yeah, no secret there. I'm just not I'm just not very creative. Let's see. You probably get this a ton. Is the U.S. national debt really that worrying, as many YouTubers and such claim? What an interesting question. Somebody kind of indirectly asked this last year, near the end of last year, and I had kind of a multi-episode long span where I kind of talked about different aspects of it. The big things that kind of strain the U.S. debt are Medicaid, Medicare, and Social Security. And so I kind of tried to read a little bit about how sustainable or unsustainable they were and commented on them. So there's a couple episodes where I comment on that pretty extensively. I don't know how much of that I can conjure up off the top of my head, though, so I can't get into that too deeply. I remember it specifically, though, because there was one episode where I was talking about Social Security, and then there was like a whole conga line of subs, which I kind of had to laugh at when I was watching it later. I wasn't sure why that kind of happened, but it was pretty humorous at the time. As far as U.S. national debt being worrying, I mean, it is a problem. So it's not something you can just ignore, but it's not as dramatic a problem as some people make it out to be. Some of those institutions, I think Social Security in particular, Social Security and Medicare, I think, have inbuilt mechanisms to kind of regulate how much they cost. So they shouldn't really go bankrupt per se or break the budget. I think the mechanism for Social Security is weaker than the one for Medicare, though. Not, I hope I'm remembering that correctly. But basically, there are inbuilt mechanisms to help with that, and the changes that are really needed to kind of make it affordable over the long run are not really that significant. You can kind of manage it on the fringes. You know, you can try to jiggle it so that it doesn't adjust as much to inflation, so that inflation eats up some of it. You can raise taxes a bit. You can reduce the scope of the benefits involved. You can raise retirement age. There's a lot of little things you can do that, in aggregate, would kind of go a long way towards, you know, relieving that pressure on the budget. So the answer is kind of yes and no. It is definitely a problem. You know, like if you do nothing, then it's definitely going to bust the budget eventually. But through deft management, and it can be dealt with. It's doable. It's not necessarily a huge problem right now. It will get to be more of a problem if it is left to fester. You know, if you do eventually do something about it, but wait until 10, 20 years, that's going to be a problem. You know, you do want to kind of do more now when it's a bit easier, when the changes that have to be made are not as dramatic than they might be later on. You know, one of the inbuilt mechanisms I mentioned could involve, if there is just a collapse in funding, a significant fall in benefits offered. And so that could be very dramatic if you do it all at once. It's much better if you just kind of slowly reduce benefits over time and maybe spread them around a little bit, so that it's not quite as a dramatic one-off loss, and so that people kind of have more time to prepare and factor that fall into their budgets. Why is it claimed that U.S. economic policy is better than it was in the 19th century when economic growth is clearly lower in the 21st century? Well, it's kind of apples and oranges, though. I mean, regardless, the U.S. economy was way different in the 19th century than it is now. I mean, now it's a services economy that has technology and services that would be borderline utopian, you know, to somebody living in the 19th century. The 19th century economy, in contrast, was mostly agricultural and was kind of just industrializing. So just radically different in those regards. That's to say nothing of the vast demographic differences. You know, demographically, the U.S. was still growing, you know, very rapidly. You know, just from internal growth, let alone from all of the immigration. Whereas now, in contrast, the demographics are kind of slowing. Even immigration is not really quite coming in at the same rate. So there's very, very different examples there. As for why it's claimed that U.S. economic policy is better than it was in the 19th century, I don't know. I haven't heard that myself. I would guess that people would point to the higher economic growth and a lot of the innovation, of which there was quite a bit in the late 19th century during the, well, I guess some people call it the Second Industrial Revolution, that sort of period of innovation and technological development that saw the emergence of electrification, you know, and a lot of things like that. You know, the what do you call them? Not cables, but I forget the technical name. But basically, intercontinental communications by cable became feasible. You know, that was another sort of innovation at the time. To say nothing of flight and, you know, all the other stuff. So there was definitely a period of rapid economic growth and industrialization in the 19th century that did benefit from laissez-faire economic management that sort of was predominant at the time. You could argue that that the U.S. economy would benefit from an environment more like that than what it is now. But that's, you know, I think that's a very different debate than saying that we should make the economy like it was in the 19th century. It's just so different that it's, I don't think it's really a good comparison to make. Let's see, two very similar but specifically different questions. Can a state of emergency be used to build a $15 billion wall over multiple years? Do you think meaningful work will be completed on the wall during the Trump presidency? And if it's not completed, will it likely continue after? That's a good question. I'm not real sure how the planning would how the planning would work. I assume that I think the Trump administration is trying to appropriate something like $4 to $5 billion for the wall now. But I don't know how much of that they're going to be able to spend quickly, like within the fiscal year. So I'm not sure if this seizure of funding so to speak, is going to be like an annual affair, so they can keep funding it, or if this is a one-time thing that they're going to use to start construction, and then hopefully get more money from, more from the legislature, basically, from more legitimate means in the future. So I'm not sure what the plan is there. They may not even be able to end up spending any of it if the courts kind of step in and stop them. Again, like I said before, I'm not real sure what the court's powers are in that regard. So I don't know if it'll span multiple years. Do you think I don't know if meaningful work will be completed during the administration. That kind of depends, again, on the courts and how much they kind of slow down the process or stop it. And if it's not completed, will it likely continue after? It's really hard to say with the Trump administration. They're very unpredictable. If there is a new administration after 2020, which I would assume would be Democrat, since I imagine most likely the Republicans would nominate Trump again. There's some question that he might face a challenger, but I suspect most likely the GOP will nominate him again for the presidency in 2020. And if that's the case and he loses, then I doubt a Democratic administration would continue construction, if indeed it was happening by that point. Let's see. And if I'll add this as an aside here. If I ever kind of misread a question, or if I don't quite get the gist of it, or what have you, feel free to ask again, and I'll be happy to return to it. It's not infrequent that happens, so do feel free to elaborate if I'm missing a key point or what have you. Let's see. Regarding emergency declaration, do you think there is hypocrisy from Dems given Obama's extensive use of executive actions, etc., against a lame duck Congress? Yeah, that is kind of the counter argument I've read, and that's kind of one of the examples of previous administrations using executive power very broadly, in kind of ways that get around Congress. So in that sense, yeah, the Trump administration is not the first to do that. The Obama administration did it. The second Bush administration did it. The Clinton administration did it. So it goes back a ways. And, you could go even further back than that to all the examples of, post-World War II administrations finding lots of innovative ways to use executive power that it hadn't kind of been intended for. So yeah, there is some hypocrisy there, but I would not really want to say that Democrats monopolize that hypocrisy. There's certainly plenty of it to go around. There's the idea of the overpowered executive branch goes back a long ways, and that's a secular trend, so to speak. That's been going on a long time, and both parties have been complicit in that.
Yeah, but Agent Smith, isn't the out group always more hypocritical than the in group?
Certainly to the individual in question. Certainly to a given individual, let's say. It always kind of appears that way. But yeah, I think I would not say the Democrats are uniquely hypocritical in that regard, if that's what's being asked. But there is some hypocrisy there. Let's see. Do you see near-term solutions, reductions in any variety for polarization / propagandization of politics? It's hard to say, because we are kind of in a weird new era. We've talked before about how much technology and structural changes to the economy are kind of having knock-on effects on society and politics that are kind of reverberating around the world, through every society. And that's a big part of the instability we see right now. And maybe there's something we could do to mitigate that, something specific or some set of specific actions that can be taken. But, given how little we really understand the dynamics that have kind of been unleashed by all of these changes, it's going to be pretty hard to really even understand fundamentally the problem that we're facing, let alone find specific solutions. So I think for now, for the next while, the process is just going to have to kind of play itself out, and we're going to just have to observe and try to gather data and then try to analyze it later once we have a better picture of what kind of society is emerging, or what kind of societies are emerging in response to all of these changes that have happened over the past few decades. So that's not a particularly satisfying solution, because, people want to get off the wild ride at this point, but I don't really think there's any way we can. So that being the case, we're probably just going to have to ride it out and hope that it doesn't go off the rails at some point. Again, maybe it's worth taking action, even if we don't fully understand things, in the hopes that we can mitigate it. But there's always a little bit of risk there. But whether or not that risk is justified comes down to personal opinion and personal preferences. I won't tell you what to believe in that regard, but that would be a conversation that'll probably happen, before too long. But yeah, I don't know of anything specific that could kind of stem that polarization, and we probably won't have any. It probably won't go away anytime soon, one way or the other. Even if we did have something that could mitigate it, it probably is just sort of a natural process that has to kind of work itself out, and then eventually reach a new equilibrium at some point in the future. That would be ideal, anyway. It may be that not even that is possible anymore. It may be that the singularity we hit was so great that we may never even hit an equilibrium again. It may be that the pace of change is just so rapid that equilibria are no longer really feasible. We may need something like a second-order equilibria, like a derivative. We may just have to kind of come to grips with perpetually living in societies that are perpetually changing and constantly in flux, such that there is no fixed state of affairs that we can kind of build our lives around and kind of set expectations accordingly. But that's all speculation on my part. That's open to debate. A bit of an older question, but what are your thoughts about A bit of an older question. What are your thoughts about President Trump's decision to pull out of Syria? Should we take seriously the Turkish foreign minister's threat to, quote, bury the Syrian Kurds in their own ditches?
Oh my goodness, unintentional pun.
Well, I'm not too worried about it. Obviously, there's a debate to be had about, whether or not the United States should be in Syria in the first place, and, if it is going to be there, what it should do. All of those are overarching conversations. But I think in general, there is a concern amongst the military in the U.S. specifically, if not also intelligence agencies, that the U.S. is giving up one of its principal sources of leverage in the Syrian conflict by pulling out, and that's a problem because it makes it because giving that up does not give the U.S. a voice at the table, so to speak, such that it can pursue its perceived interests in the region, and in so much as they relate to the Syrian conflict. So in that sense, it could be argued to be a bad thing. You could argue that it's a good thing in so much as the U.S. doesn't really have any clear interest in Syria, and that mostly U.S. involvement has kind of been a net negative in so much as it's perpetuated the conflict. Although I would argue American indecision about what to do in the conflict has probably been the greater impact there as far as U.S. impact. Should we take seriously Turkish foreign minister's threat? To a degree, that's cheap talk. I don't think that Turkey would seriously threaten the Kurds if the U.S. was there. And if it leaves, then there's a very good chance they would. I don't know how violent it would be. It would probably be more indirect, more probably done through the Free Syrian Army or other proxies. But yeah, if the U.S. is not there, that completely changes the balance of power in Syria. And so that would definitely be a concern. But again, the thing is, I'm skeptical the U.S. is actually going to leave because a lot of the military is so opposed to it. And over the past month and change, U.S. policy has kind of slowly walked back from that withdrawal announcement. There have been conditions added to it that Turkey would have to respect the Kurds, and there's ongoing negotiations on that. And every so often they release something new. We're not really leaving. We're going to go to a base in Iraq, but then the Iraqis announced that we can't really do that. So there's a lot of uncertainty about the pullout, such that I don't really think it's going to happen. I think the Trump administration kind of announced it to announce it, and that actual policy probably won't change all that much going forward. So because of that skepticism on my part, I don't really take Turkish threats very seriously, because I don't think they'll attack while the U.S. is there, and I still think the U.S. will be there. At least for the near term anyway. Medium term, who knows? And the Trump administration being unpredictable, who's to say maybe they actually do pull out troops? I don't know. But that's my prediction anyway. That's my perception of where things are as far as Syria policy right now. So I don't really predict Turkey's going to do that. So I don't think the Kurds are too threatened by that right now. I think they're more threatened by indecision in the U.S. government. I think that's because that seems to change pretty radically over very short periods of time. And given how dependent the Kurds are on U.S. protection, they're understandably a bit consternated by the shifts in U.S. policy there and the uncertainty. I actually did, in the podcast that I technically do have, I'm still working on that, but the episodes I have released are on Syria, so if somebody's interested in hearing me drone on about Syria interminably, check out my podcast. Because I've got a couple hours of that. It's my first crack at podcasting, so it's not great, but it is there if you're interested. Let's see, are there any measures of human economic well-being that are better than GDP? That's kind of a subjective question. It really depends on how you want to measure economic well-being.
Self-reported happiness.
That is one measure, and I think somebody did make like a happiness index somewhere. There's also, some people like the Human Development Index. Yeah, it just really depends on what you prioritize. You know, I mean, odds are that if you're politically left, or far left anyway, you probably would want something that prioritizes basic needs, whether or not people's basic needs are met, and security, whether or not you are secure, have job security, and how much anxiety you have. In turn, if you're more on the political right or the far right, you would probably value something more like opportunities or output, production and productivity. So there's a whole other spectrum of preferences there. I don't even know all of them, but yeah, there are definitely other ways that you could measure the economy and economic well-being. If you're specifically interested in economic well-being, specifically human well-being, there's GDP is not very good at that. GDP is specifically meant to measure material output. And economists generally use that because, in general, we assume that if there's more material output, if there is more material per capita, then in general, societies are better off, people are better off, and there's a higher standard of living. That's a very general rule. It doesn't really encompass all of the differences in opinion about what makes a good society, what makes a good life, etc. It is meant to be just a general rule of thumb that focuses on the material. And part of that is just because of the math. I mean, you can quantify material, but quantifying happiness is very fuzzy. It's very difficult. That's not really something you can nail down as easily as how many widgets get produced in a factory in a given year. That in contrast is very readily quantifiable. The whole perspective of economics in general homes in on material production. And so it disproportionately focuses on that. I don't really think of that as a flaw in economics. I know some people kind of criticize economics for that, but it's a tool. That's how it should really be thought of. Economics and economic methodology is a tool by which you can understand an economy and make changes to it, but it's not the only tool you use. You don't have to restrict yourself solely to economic models and economic logic, etc. It's just meant as an aid in policy making, not a guide per se. So I think economics kind of gets a bad rap on that count. People kind of blame economists for policies they see as inhuman or unfair or unproductive, but that's not what economists and economics as a field is for. We're more just about analysis. We try to understand what policies are going to do, how they're going to function, how they'll interact with the economy. But beyond that, anything else you want beyond that, you would have to go elsewhere. And it's not our fault if politicians use economic models and research and whatnot for their own ends and sort of distort them for various reasons, whatever they may be. Nobody listens to economists anyway. They really don't. There's a lot of deep economic research out there that really tries to grasp difficult economic questions, but nobody really gives a shit. Mostly politicians and political actors of one sort or another, they only really dip into economic research when they need an excuse to do something that they're going to do anyway. So it's not like they're really just delving into economic research and trying to find the best policy. They basically already picked a policy and then just tap our stuff to try to rationalize it. So don't blame us for that. Let's see. What are your preferred news sources? Well, a quick guide is you could just look at the Twitter, because that's pretty much a representative sample. You know, a lot of BBC World News articles, occasionally CS Monitor. The Diplomat is good for Asia Pacific news. Foreign Policy Mag is good for, you know, general foreign policy. Now, Foreign Affairs is very good for foreign policy analysis. Been trying to read that more. I pay for the damn thing, so I ought to read it more. The Economist is pretty good. Mind you, I'm not saying these sources don't have biases. We've talked a lot about this before. You know, every news source has a bias. You know, it's best to... There are two kind of general approaches that we generally bring up when we talk about this. One, try to understand the bias of the source so that you can kind of control for it. And two, try to be as informed on the topic you're reading about as possible so that you can bring your own criticism to the article. I know that that's kind of counterintuitive, because a lot of the times people read articles to understand given topics. But basically, if you're not really familiar with the topic, bring a lot of skepticism if you're still learning about it. And then once you've kind of reached a point where you're confident you know more about it, then just be skeptical and critical and try to bring your knowledge to anything you read about it. There's no magic news source that's going to be your one source. That's going to be the one true source of all knowledge and power. You've always got to be skeptical, and you've always got to try to be as informed as you can. And that's just inherently difficult. It's just, there's no easy way to do it. There's nowhere you can go to have somebody tell you what's easily true. And that goes doubly for me. I don't want anybody listening to me thinking they're getting the gospel truth about the world and how it all works. I'm trying to give you tools, information, and my own perception.
But what if I want the gospel truth, and I want you to play up my emotions to drum up support?
Consult a priest. Consult a priest. That's the old saying here in the U.S. Consult a priest. Yeah, I'm not that guy. I couldn't be even if I wanted to be. I'm not that good at, you know, argumentation or manipulation. So you're gonna have to go elsewhere for that. Yeah. So roughly those are my preferred news sources, though. If you are interested in that, that's kind of and I sometimes hit up a think tank, and I'll hit up Google if I want to get more in depth in a given topic. I was doing a lot of that earlier today, trying to kind of catch up on some of the workload on this. I think that's a decent outline, at least off the top of my head. I got a whole list of news sources, but those are the main ones I hit the most frequently. Got like an entire Excel sheet of stuff. Let's see, what economic or systematic change has to occur for Big Pharma to have less of a grip on the lawmaking process? Well, I guess the short answer is healthcare reform, because a lot of it ties into Well, I'm going to assume here that this person is talking about the U.S. and U.S. politics, and I would assume in the U.S.'s case it would deal with healthcare reform and changing how the U.S. government, and specifically Medicaid and Medicare, if not also Social Security, kind of interacts with the pharmaceutical industry in negotiating prices for drugs and whatnot. Because that's kind of a big source of influence right there. But I don't know that the pharmaceutical industry has as much of a grip on the lawmaking process as people kind of think it does. Well, it probably has more than a lot of people think it does. But I don't think it has as much as a lot of activists think it does either. And this ties into an overarching conversation in the U.S. about lobbying and the impact of lobbying on the lawmaking process, on the policy-making process, I should say. And it's not really as great as you might think. You know, most lobbyists spend most of their money on politicians in districts where they already kind of think what they want them to think, so to speak. You know, basically lawmakers in areas, parts of the country where the ideology is already kind of predisposed, where the constituents are already predisposed to favor policies that any given lobbyist industry wants. Those are more where lobbyists go to. So it's not like they're going to uh, areas where they're not already present. It's not like they're trying to bribe people to change their mind, or going to swing districts or something and really trying to kind of tip the balance. It's more about reinforcing the politicians who already agree with them and trying to give them more of an incentive. And keep in mind that money is not necessarily the biggest tool that lobbyists have to offer. Probably more important than the money is information, access more specifically. If you're a lobbyist and you're perceived as an important economic or political actor, you're more likely to get access to a given politician, and they're more likely to listen to you. And at that point, you can introduce them to information about a topic of interest and, quote unquote, inform them about it. Now, to the degree to which that information is actually accurate, and the degree to which they act on that information because it's legitimate, or because they just wanted to anyway, or because they think that they're going to get a big donation out of it later, that's all very difficult to determine because it's kind of ambiguous. It's kind of hard to tease out in the data, quantitatively. But in general, that's kind of the way it works. It's not necessarily bribing politicians to vote a certain way. It's more about trying to color how they understand a given issue, such that they're more likely to propose a policy and implement a policy that is more favorable to the lobbyists' interests. So it's a more finessed process than it's kind of given credit for amongst the activists who kind of paint it as explicit bribery. That's not really how it works, per se. So that's why I'm a little incredulous here, talking about specifically Big Pharma. I don't think there's a whole lot you can do to necessarily... I don't think Big Pharma has like a really tight grip on the lawmaking process, per se. I think really the problem of which Big Pharma is a part, that, in so much as it relates to the healthcare system in the U.S., ties in more to that overarching debate about the healthcare system. There are political structural factors that kind of make it difficult to change the healthcare system in the U.S., specifically big differences in philosophy between different ideas on how to reform it. I think that's the bigger block there. That's the bigger issue there than big money, money in politics, specifically pharmaceutical lobbying. And I would admit that I'm not a political science guy. I don't have that kind of background, so I'm not as familiar with that issue. So I would certainly welcome input from chat on that. But that's what I remember reading about back when I was studying government in grad school. Again, I could be off on that, and I would welcome input, but I'm just sharing my understanding on that particular aspect. And I want to try to explain that so I can explain why I don't think there's a whole lot you can do to really loosen or weaken, more accurately, big pharma lobbying, so to speak. Their grips, such as it is kind of an informal grip. It's more something their influence stems more from that information and access than it does to big money. It has to do more with that factor and just the overarching design of the healthcare system. So in general, I guess the short answer, if you want to weaken that influence, you would have to, one, change the structure of healthcare in the U.S. such that negotiations with the pharmaceutical industry are not as relevant to the policy-making process. And then you would also have to, I don't know, tax them more, or just, if you're really explicitly just looking to reduce the access of the pharmaceutical industry to government, you would probably have to tax them to reduce their resources with which they can do that, and maybe break them up with some antitrust legislation. We already have some, but you could kind of strengthen it and really be forceful about it. But if you push too hard, then you risk actually damaging the legitimate underlying industry, and that's kind of a problem in itself. And if you are a big pharma lobbyist, you're going to do as much as you can to obfuscate the difference between big pharma, the excess, corporate power, as opposed to the underlying actual industry. And there's no hard way to determine where that borderline is, which is why, in general, that isn't really a thing that you do in policy making. But yeah, that's kind of a confused, fuzzy answer to the question. I apologize. I'm not as familiar as I could be on it. But that's kind of what I have off the top of my head. That's what I remember about it. Why is executive power a thing? Doesn't seem very democratic. You can only have so much democracy. That's the short answer. There's at some point in any political system, you're just going to have to give some discretionary power to somebody. And the degree of discretionary power you give and who you give it to varies from political system to political system.
One aspect that I think resonates a little bit here with StarCraft, since we have a primarily StarCraft audience, is reaction speed and how long it takes a body of people to make a decision as opposed to a person in a cabinet. And if you have like states of active war and stuff, you don't always have the time to let the Democrats and Republicans kind of squabble about something. If it's really urgent, then you do want to have a branch that can act really fast to respond to really big threats that if you did actually take the time, you're just toast.
Yeah. That's the benefit of an executive branch, and that's kind of why, governments have it. They act purposely and forcibly and relatively quickly compared to legislatures. And because they do that, they've been imbued with more and more power over the past 100 years as society has sped up, so to speak. It used to be that if somebody declared war on you, you would have kind of a couple months to prepare. Way back in like the 1700s, 1800s, information traveled very slow. Decision-making could in turn be kind of equally slow. So there was more time to be deliberative and to kind of form plans and policies. That changed as industrialization hit and kind of shrank time and space. Communications happen extremely rapidly now. And, starting with, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, communication started to happen very rapidly. And, technology improved such that, say, a war could be declared and then be acted upon, within a matter of days. So if you have a very slow, deliberative process of type of government, that could be a very big problem if you're still having to debate what to do about a declaration of war, why the other guy's army is already invading you. So you do need to have some faster action there, some mechanism that can kind of respond more quickly. And the response to the technological changes to society that kind of facilitate that speed have kind of necessitated, debatably, more and more power going to the executive branch so that they can more and more readily deal with challenges like that. Now, I think there's a very good argument to be made that kind of the things have swung too far in the other direction, that it kind of has too much discretionary power now. But that's a whole debate in and of itself. But as for why executive power is a thing, that's why. The discretionary power is, to a degree, inevitable. Like I said, there's, even in a very highly democratic society where everything is deliberative and whatnot, there's going to be a point where you just kind of have to trust politicians to act on the public will. And they may or may not have to, depending on the structure of how your government is run. But the trade-off is the more discretionary power you give to the executive, the more readily they can act on problems. The more centralized your administration, the more power you have centralized there to kind of deal with issues. And every society has to decide what kind of trade-off it wants to make in that regard. In presidential political systems like what we have in the US, and really much of the Western Hemisphere, the trade-off is generally to give more discretionary power to the executive branch in exchange for more of that administrative capacity. Other societies kind of don't do that as much. It kind of varies from place to place, but that's explicitly how presidential systems really work. That is a strong executive branch in that case. And how democratic it is varies from system to system and kind of depends on, the society in question. To have an executive branch just kind of go around and doing whatever it wants, that's not democratic, even if the executive in question was himself democratically elected or herself. But if a society does reach a consensus where they all agree that an executive branch should have a certain amount of discretionary power, and then the executive branch does use that discretionary power, even if it's maybe in a somewhat controversial way, that's not necessarily undemocratic, because presumably the society that allowed for that system that trade-off to be made in the first place, understood that things like that would happen, and accepted that, at least up to a point. So you could argue that even in somewhat illegitimate uses of the power, it's still somewhat democratic in so much as that was kind of an accepted risk when people implemented the system in the first place.
Well, the phrase that the founding fathers used was protection against tyranny of the masses. That's why you have electoral branch, you have the electoral college, stuff like that. So
Yeah.
if your average citizen is not very well informed about what's going on, you don't really want them to have a ton of say, especially with things like foreign policy. I think a lot of foreign policy, your average working citizen, they don't really have a great reason to be super on top of that. So for them to make decisions on like what we're doing in various countries and stuff doesn't make a ton of sense.
Yeah.
Looking at it from the perspective of the government.
Yeah. Yeah, that's from the early days of the US, that was really kind of the impetus. You know, you were, I think, only landowners. It was pretty much only landowners who could vote, and you had to be white and you had to be male. So a relatively narrow selectorate, relatively broad for the time. I don't think there was a lot of places that did much better in that regard. That was kind of more the norm, but it was a pretty narrow slice of the population, and it kind of had to grow later. But yeah, that is sort of the idea. You can't, you have to make decisions about who can make decisions, you know, who's relevant to the decision-making process, who makes those decisions, and how are they implemented and administrated.
Yo, dog, I heard you like decisions. I made a decision in your decision, so you can decide who decides.
So roughly, that's why executive power is a thing, and why it's democratic. The degree to which it's democratic is debatable. That's why that's sort of where the debate is. Have you heard about Hambach Forest in Germany? Not really something current, but in the last half year maybe. In the last half year, maybe last September/October. A bit curious how far and how it spreads in open pit lignite mining. I haven't heard about it at all, so I can't really comment. I guess I'll open a tab so I can try to look into it later, but unfortunately I'm not sure what this refers to. So let's see. Why is Trump so interested in Venezuela? Interfering in other countries' politics is bad publicity. I don't know that there's any such thing to Donald Trump as bad publicity. He seems to have kind of defied PR gravity in that regard. So I don't know that he really cares that much about that kind of thing. Why is he so interested in Venezuela? I don't know. We talked a bit about that last week, and I'm still not real clear on just what the U.S. government thinks it's going to accomplish there, or what its objectives are. I guess nominally you could say it's overthrowing the Chavista government, but that seems pretty unachievable. That seems like a bridge too far. Maybe you could overthrow the Maduro government specifically, but I don't think any government that comes after would really be any less Chavista. It might be less corrupt, less authoritarian, but I think the Chavistas are probably there to stay. So if they're hoping to end Chavismo, so to speak, that's not going to work. Overthrowing Maduro is a little more feasible, but very difficult given how much political capital he has to work with in Venezuela. You could argue they just want to undermine the government, but I don't know what else they could do to undermine it that the government itself isn't already doing to itself, so that kind of seems like redundant effort. Yeah, I don't really get it myself. It's not clear to me. I'm kind of waiting for some revelatory moment when the US government kind of tips its hand, but so far they haven't really done that.
Well, isn't it a general trend for Trump to kind of look for perceived nations that can be portrayed as opponents? Because he's got that strongman leader kind of approach to it.
He does.
So if he's kind of calling out enemies and things like that, that drums up support for him and make it look like he's bold and taking initiatives and things like that. Because his base doesn't want a peacemaker who's going to say, oh, Venezuela, they've opposed us in certain ways. Let's try to find a way to be friends. They would be like, what? But if he paints them as an opponent that he's going to crush, they're like, yeah, get him.
Well, I would agree with that assessment, but I don't think part of Trump's appeal is also that he's kind of anti-interventionist. He's not really gung ho about invading other countries and that kind of thing. That's kind of been his whole bag on Syria, trying to get the U.S. troops out of Syria, because he doesn't see much point in them being there. Obviously, he's been very hawkish on Iran, but in general, beyond Iran, he's been pretty gun-shy about interventionism. That's part of what his appeal was to his constituents during the 2016 election. So Venezuela is a bit of an anomaly in that sense. I suspect some of that is the influence of hawks in the administration, like John Bolton. There's certainly a history amongst people like him that favors a certain amount of intervention depending on context. So you could argue that the U.S. government is concerned about what it perceives to be a hostile government in Venezuela that is working with the Cuban government, perhaps has even been infiltrated by the Cuban government and Cuban communists, and that is becoming increasingly aligned with outside extrahemispheric powers. I think that's about the only framing that would make sense if you were trying to justify an U.S. intervention in Venezuela. But that framing is shaky because the Venezuelan government, like I said last week, it's more a threat to itself than it is to anybody else at this point. Its quote-unquote alliance with Russia or China is not really an alliance. It's very weak, it's very nascent, and neither Russia or China are really interested in investing a lot of capital in the relationship. Russia's already dumped a lot of money. Actually, China has too. They've lent a lot of money to the Venezuelan government, and they're probably never getting any of that money back. And I don't know that they're really interested in throwing more good money after bad. So I don't think that's going to flower into a great strategic partnership in future, not least because they would be concerned about an inevitable U.S. backlash if it did. And the Venezuelan government itself lacks the capacity to kind of project power beyond Venezuela. I mean, I don't really consider refugees to be projecting power, and that's pretty much the only impact they're really having outside Venezuela. So I'm just not really sold on the idea that the U.S. government is just really going out of its way to overthrow the government. But it's obviously doing something, because I don't think the National Assembly's president pro temp, Guaido, I don't think he would be able to kind of summon the foreign aid that he's been getting without U.S. help. And I think there were U.S. transport planes who were helping transport it. So pretty clearly there's a U.S. connection there. But again, I'm just not sure what the ultimate end game is. I'm not sure what they're trying to do.
For people who haven't listened to many of these or don't know, hawks are kind of aggressive interventionist politicians, and doves are peacemakers and pacifists who usually want to reduce conflict wherever possible.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
so there's some examples would be Hillary Clinton is more hawkish than Barack Obama.
Yeah, it's a spectrum. And there's a fair number of hawks in the Trump administration. They've kind of come and gone with time. There's been a lot of turnover, but in general, there's been a pretty persistent hawkish element in their foreign policy team. Let's see. Yeah, the latest thing is that there's foreign aid being kind of accumulated around Venezuela, on the borders of Venezuela, and I think the Guaido is trying to figure out a way to get it in so that he can distribute it as a way to build up his political base. The highways have been blocked by the Venezuelan army, so that's not happening. And I think recently the latest thing is that he asked Venezuelans to kind of come on foot and take it into Venezuela. That way, avoiding the roads. But the problem with that is that it means that he's kind of giving up a certain amount of control over the financial aid. And one of the big problems in Venezuela is the black market. People will buy subsidized goods because there are price controls in Venezuela. So nothing is really quite priced correctly. Everything is underpriced. So you can buy subsidized goods, where you can find them, and then turn them around and sell them at a profit on the black market or for an even greater profit in other countries. So there's a lot of arbitrage there. So I think any financial aid that kind of gets arbitrarily distributed in Venezuela will probably suffer a similar fate. Free stuff can be sold at a very high profit, and so you just kind of give it out to anyone. Most likely, that's probably where a lot of it will end up. So I think a certain amount of organization will be necessary if that foreign aid is actually going to be leveraged by the National Assembly into any kind of political leverage against the Maduro administration. We'll see. That's something to watch. But I can't really comment on it beyond that because, again, I don't really know what's going on any more than anybody else does. Let's see. What are your thoughts about the modern quote-unquote printing of money and the gold standard? Do you think there's a correlation between the stability of the gold standard with the stability of the economy during those years and the instability of the value of the dollar and the instability of modern economies? All right, let me think about this one. Modern printing of money and the gold standard. Well, we don't really have the gold standard anymore.
It's been a while.
Yeah, it's been a couple decades now. Actually, it's been longer than that. I mean, technically, it ended rather more than half a century ago, and the Bretton Woods system was kind of a pseudo gold standard, sort of half gold, half U.S. dollar. And then that kind of collapsed in the early 70s, I think, and it's pretty much just been a floating exchange since then. Modern printing of money, there's not really printing of money in terms of, if you're talking about seigniorage, there's not really any systematic printing of money like that. There has been a substantial increase in the money supply stemming from stimulus, a monetary stimulus from central banks. So there's been a lot of excess lending, you could argue, stemming from a lot of that quantitative easing that kind of came out of the 2008 financial crisis. That's an issue. It's kind of unclear what effect that's had and will have. It was kind of assumed that if you allowed a lot of quantitative easing and allowed financial institutions to pump money into the global economy, that there would be inflation at some point, and it kind of hasn't happened. If it has happened, it's been very localized in particular parts of the world, but there's been no systematic global inflation that you can kind of point to and say is the result of monetary stimulus and quantitative easing. That's kind of an open mystery. We talked a little before about sort of the mystery of missing inflation in the world economy and in national economies. But it's not printing money per se. It's not actual seigniorage. Again, I can't really link it to the gold standard per se because there really isn't one. I don't think anybody links their currency now to gold anymore. I think there's anybody left who does. I think either currencies are free floating or they're pegged to another currency. But I don't think anybody pegs it to pegs it to gold anymore. I think Venezuela tried to peg theirs to oil last year, a couple of years ago. I don't think anything really came of that, though. Nobody really trusted that they would be able to redeem their Venezuelan bolivars for oil. Kind of have to trust the government for that to work, and there's not a lot of trust in the Maduro administration at this point in global markets. So let's see, do you think there's a correlation between the stability of the gold standard with the stability of the economy during those years? Not sure which years you mean. The instability of the value of the dollar and the instability of... I don't think the dollar's that unstable. It's been pretty consistent. I think it's been increasing in value recently, and then there was a while after 2008 when it depreciated. And then it depreciated also after the 2001. I think in general it devalues during any recession, but I remember specifically early in the aughts there was a period when it particularly devalued after the dot-com bust. But it kind of reflated after that. It's just kind of been up and down, but I wouldn't call it unstable, per se. It's been decent. Stability of the dollar. I don't think modern economies are really all that unstable either. In general, the global economy and national economies have done okay over the past 10 years. The problem is more in how the gains of economic growth have been distributed, how individual communities and industries have fared. There's been a lot of variance in that regard. So there's just been a lot of churn in the economy. And that's kind of more the problem than just a poorly performing or unstable economy. They're actually, technically, the United States is in one of its longest periods of economic growth in its history. Doesn't really feel like it, but technically that's true. So the problem isn't necessarily economic growth per se, it's more in how the economy is performing on a more micro level. So I guess I would ask for a little elaboration on the question and kind of what's meant here. I'm a little confused on that count. Let's see, what are your thoughts on the agricultural efficiencies and environmental benefit of a plant-based diet? This is kind of more environmental research, and I'm not as familiar with that. I've read a little bit about it in the news, but that's pretty limited. From what I remember reading, agricultural efficiencies, quote-unquote, I mean, technically it's more efficient to have just the prototypical, I guess, factory farming is what people have kind of been calling it. I think technically that is more cost efficient, but it's not very environmentally beneficial. Well, you're asking specifically about a plant-based diet. Yeah, in general, from what I read, meat is very energy inefficient, so plants are much more efficient in terms of the dietary needs that a person needs. So economically speaking, the supply chain and the costs of a purely plant-based diet are much less than the costs and much less complicated than the supply chain for meat. So in that sense, you could argue that plants are the more efficient, economically speaking, than meat.
One important point of context with this discussion that usually people don't really think about too much is the availability of food and how that's changed over time, and how there are certain populations in certain places that physically could not exist on plant-based diets because the climate is not fitting for that. So an example would be like Iceland or northern Canada or Siberia and stuff, where, yeah, if you have the farming land, that is a more efficient route, but that's not present all around the world. So this is sort of a new question that we get to ask that we couldn't ask historically and prehistorically.
Yeah, that's kind of my impression. Efficiencies. In general, plants, plant-based supply chains are more efficient than meat-based supply chains. That's a weird way of putting it, but that's a quick summary. I think plants are also, again, a plant-based supply chain is more environmentally beneficial, because I think it's supposed to produce less carbon, I think. Again, well outside my area of expertise, and I don't even know how you really calculate environmental benefit, since that seems like it would be a difficult to define term. I'm not even sure how people really calculate carbon emissions, given how abstract that can get. In cost-benefit analysis, if you're trying to understand how a policy is going to affect something, whatever industry or what have you, you generally focus on primary effects. How is this directly going to affect the industry in question? But then you also research secondary effects, which kind of looks at some of the indirect knock-on effects that the policy will have, not only on the industry in question, but other industries. And perhaps there's also, it affects other industries, and then in turn, through those industries, comes back around and affects the main industry again. So it gets kind of complicated once you get into secondary effects. So I imagine there's something similar with the estimation of carbon production. If you're just looking explicitly at carbon production, the quote-unquote primary effect, it's probably pretty straightforward. But if you start looking at things like, the amount of carbon that's produced in the supply chain and production and, all of the opportunity cost type calculations of how carbon is produced, that seems like it would be immensely difficult to calculate. And again, not being familiar enough with the methodology, I'm not sure how that works entirely. That's something I need to do. I have a very long list of such things to do, but I don't really fully comprehend that, so my answer can't really be in depth in that regard. But what I've read, again, in the news is that in general, yes, plant-based diets are a little better in terms of agricultural efficiency and environmental benefit than an equivalent meat-based diet. But my thoughts in that regard are just very basic. You know, that's not great commentary. That's just not quite my field, unfortunately. Hopefully some people in chat are arguing about it and adding lots of detail. Generally that's how the details get fleshed out in chat. Sometimes somebody just kind of chips in, but other times details are slowly unveiled over the course of a heated debate between knowledgeable counterparties.
That's a debate that comes up rather often.
Well, if you're going to have a debate, that's the kind you want. There are far worse. Let's see. Do you feel the U.S. should focus more inward or outward for problems? Could be anything. Or do you feel we are doing fine on focus? What the U.S. should do is kind of a subjective thing. That kind of depends on individual political preferences and goals, priorities. So the answer you get to that will vary from person to person. What the U.S. should do as far as focusing more inwards or outwards probably just depends on your perspective on whether the U.S. really needs to have a strong, prominent role in global affairs, whether the U.S. is doing enough domestically to address economic issues, social justice, things like that. There's a lot of different political variables that define how people view or how people define what the U.S. government should, quote unquote, be doing domestically and internationally. And all of those variables just vary wildly depending on what you think is important. So I guess my answer there would be it depends. It depends on what your priorities are and kind of what you're looking for the U.S. government to do. Obviously, a lot of people feel that the U.S. government does not do enough in terms of nation building at home, I think was the cutesy phrase used here during the 2016 election. If not before, I think it actually is an older term. So there are a lot of people who want that, and that kind of spans the political spectrum. There are people on the left who kind of want national health care and more social spending. But there are also people on the right who want a less interventionist U.S. government because they think the U.S. government should invest in things like infrastructure, education, and other types of things like that. But then there's also people who think that the U.S. does and should have a strong role in world affairs, and they think that, well, yes, there should perhaps be more done domestically, that's more of a trade-off than a binary. It doesn't have to be the U.S. giving up its role as a global actor and focusing exclusively on the domestic. It could be a shift in the spectrum more towards the domestic, which I think most people would probably be okay with. Not everybody would agree with it, but I think everybody would kind of accept that as being a viable outcome, something that could be negotiated in a political compromise between competing groups. Again, all of that is very sort of fuzzy and subjective. It just depends on what people can agree on and what individual preferences are. Let's see. If healthcare spending continues to increase at its current pace, it is estimated that by 2040, 100% of the federal budget will go onto healthcare and Medicare expenses, leaving nothing for anyone else. Also, national defense has declared healthcare as an existential threat to the U.S. Are you aware of this, and what are your thoughts on this statement published by National Defense? Well, like a lot of things published by national defense institutions, I suspect it's a bit overwrought. That's not unusual. That's just kind of the institutional bias of defense institutions, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. Everything is an existential threat to some degree or another. I think earlier there was a publication from, I don't remember who it was. It might have been the Army or the Joint Chiefs, something like that. But there was a defense institution in the U.S. that published a paper talking about the existential threat posed by climate change. So there's a whole spectrum of threats like that the military, different parts of the military generally feel are threats that need to be addressed. So whatever your political preferences, whatever issue you care about, you can probably find a paper published by the military that says it's a big threat that needs to be addressed. So it doesn't surprise me that there would have been a publication like that addressing the budget and budget issues. As for healthcare and Medicare expenses becoming eventually 100% of the budget, I think I had heard that. The 2040 estimate is a bit early, I think, from what I read, though. That's a new one on me. What I read is that it would be something, oh, what was it? It was some ridiculously large percentage of the budget. Well, the time frame from the study I was looking at was like 100 years. They were looking at how the budget would look in 2100. I think that was roughly their time frame. And that was from that estimate, they estimated that what the costs of all of those social programs would be, and it was just astronomical. So if this study that you're referencing here is similar to that, then I imagine it's kind of making a lot of assumptions to get that number. And one of the assumptions you mentioned is that if nothing is done, if it increases at its current pace. For one, it's unlikely to increase at its current pace. There's probably going to be variance in the pace over time. Keep in mind, one of the reasons really driving increased spending in a lot of these social programs is the demography of the United States, specifically the aging population. There was a huge population explosion after World War II that created the baby boomer generation, and they've been moving through American history since then, kind of like a giant stone through a goose's neck. They just kind of push everything aside and dominate whatever given era they kind of encounter because they are such a large demographic. It was such a dramatic increase in population. But what's going to happen is that eventually that's going to even out. Population growth in the US is a bit larger than other developed societies, but the population growth is going to be a lot smaller going forward once the baby boomer generation kind of phases out. So there's going to be some dramatic increases in costs as the baby boomer generation ages, because there's going to be a lot of healthcare costs, social costs, etc., to kind of pay for them. But eventually their population is going to top out. And after that, the rate of increase is going to slow dramatically. So at that point, some of that, if not most of that, budget pressure is going to be relieved. That's going to be a long-term process, and you're going to still have to act before that. But that's just an example of how some of these problems are not permanent. That's an example of how the current pace of cost is not going to increase interminably. But there are other assumptions that you could challenge. I imagine one of the assumptions in that budget estimate is that nothing is done in the interim. And that's pretty unlikely. There's already been some steps taken, and the most likely outcome is that further steps are going to be taken in the future as well. A lot of the steps taken are generally at the margins, and they're taken very quietly because they're generally pretty unpopular. Adjusting the way that Social Security benefits are calculated in such a way that they don't keep track of inflation or cost of living or what have you, that's an inherently unpopular move. So when it's done, it's generally done in a very technical way and done obscurely, so that it doesn't really make the news. I think specifically that has happened. I think it happened at some point under the Obama administration. I don't quite remember exactly when. But I think I remember reading about that being something that was kind of snuck into a budget somewhere. So most likely the fixes will kind of be at the margins and will kind of trickle in over time rather than being one dramatic reform effort that really changes the very foundations of social programs in the US. It's just a lot more politically feasible to address the problem that way. Major reforms are hugely controversial and they tend to get bogged down, whereas minor technical changes tend to be much less subject to debate, and half the time people don't even notice them. So I still don't think that it's as much of a problem as it's sometimes made out to be. That said, I still recognize it as a problem that has to be addressed, but I think it will be addressed. Even if the marginal changes don't really fully address it, I think there will be more substantive changes made later, especially if it does kind of emerge as a specter on the horizon that actually begins to gain the public's attention. But for now, sort of the doomsday never really quite comes, because there's always some policy action taken to kind of kick the can further down the road, to kind of mitigate the damage. So let's see, how do you feel about the DNC and Democratic side will progress Will they become more radical and feed off each other more? If so, then the socialist agenda they are pushing, how do you think it will affect our republic? I have my own views. I was just trying to get another perspective. So let's see. How do I think that the Democratic Party is going to progress in the future? I mean, it's hard to say over the long term. You know, we've talked before about how predictions over the long term are pretty much impossible. I don't know that I really know enough about the Democratic Party and its constituents to know exactly, you know, because you need a lot of information to make a prediction about trajectory over the medium term. You know, even the short term is kind of dicey with any political party. I don't think it's going to radicalize. You know, I suspect it will shift to the left. You know, in general, one of the trends in American politics over the past few decades has been a shift towards more the far left and far right. So the fringes of the political spectrum have been getting more powerful relative to the center over the past few decades. But that said, I think part of that is just a function of all of the economic churn that I was talking about earlier, you know, that structural economic change and the technological change and the effects they're having on overarching society. So I think eventually, ideally, that's going to even out, that's going to stabilize, and then once it does, the politics in turn will also stabilize. So I don't think politics is going to be, you know, perpetually ratcheting up, becoming more radical. I think eventually it will kind of top out, you know, kind of reach an equilibrium, and probably at that point things will start moderating again. That's speculation on my part. It could be true, maybe it pounds out like that, maybe it doesn't. But I don't really see enough evidence of radicalization amongst the far left in particular to say that the Democrats are inevitably going to become like the Socialist Party USA. You know, that seems like a stretch at this point. Certainly sentiment is growing in favor of more government intervention in the economy, more social programs. There is a lot more support for that, and probably will be going forward. But I don't think it's going to be Europe either. You know, I don't think we're going to end up like the UK or France or, you know, what have you.
Well,
Could be wrong.
Both parties right now are kind of trying to fight for the soul and of what they are and trying to actualize.
Yes.
Because the current Republican Party is very different from the Republican Party of the 90s or even the Bush administration, the second
That's
Bush
putting
administration.
it mildly.
Yeah, so the Democratic Party, I think they need to figure out how to create a contender for that, because it's like a new meta of what the parties are representing. It's almost kind of throwback because it seems more emotional and less dry, and that's what's been winning recently, as opposed to historically, a lot of politics is just really boring. Whereas now, a lot of times the people running will bring up a bunch of issues that you could say, on the scale of the country, don't really matter for the survival of it, but they're issues that people have very strong opinions on a personal level.
Yeah.
So that shift is something that I think Hillary Clinton wasn't able to strike those chords, which is part of why she lost. And then with the whole Bernie Sanders and the DNC problem, that also put the party in a really bad light. So it's kind of like, how do we win? How do we talk to the American people and get them fired up? And also get enough of the moderates so that we can be a winning party.
Yeah. Yeah, part of the reason, you know, kind of a determinant of those, you know, factors is in part what may be a political realignment in motion. You know, every so often in American history, and really in, you know, probably in any country, there are periods of history where the traditional political coalitions that define different political groups change. The different political alliances kind of break up and reform along new lines. Hence the name, you know, realignment. And it may be that we're in a period of history where there's been sufficient churn economically and politically that the traditional alliances and coalitions are breaking apart, and we're seeing kind of a process of discovery where all of those different factions are trying to see who their viable potential partners are, you know, what the best coalition will be and how that kind of works out in the long run, kind of getting through that process. And, you know, for now, it's looking like, well, just to kind of break down the parties, The Republican Party traditionally in the U.S. was the party of business, nationalism, uh, national security, and social conservatism. Roughly that's sort of the different major constituent parts of that Republican coalition. And the Democratic Party, in turn, was, well, I mean, over the past few decades anyway, it's been predicated more on ethnic minorities, students, urban professionals, and unions, at least what's left of the unions. So all of those groups kind of comprise their core constituents. And what's happened over the past few decades is that core parts of those respective coalitions have grown very disenchanted with those coalitions. They increasingly feel that they don't represent them and that government no longer really looks after their interests. So there's basically been in both parties, to different degrees, rebellions. There are political factions that are kind of jockeying for more power. And in the case of the Republican Party, you saw a lot of that during the Obama years with the Tea Party revolt, if you want to call it that. The Tea Party movement, let's call it that. And that resulted in a lot of tension between the traditional sort of pro-business moderate Republicans and sort of the more socially conservative and libertarian wings of the party. Libertarian, socially conservative people being more the Tea Party movement types. And they pushed very hard against the establishment Republicans, and that led to a lot of drama during the Obama years, a lot of obstructionism, a lot of activism, a lot of controversial laws, to say nothing of drama within the Republican Party, because, the Republican Party, well, both political parties traditionally have tried to run their affairs at the federal level in Washington in a very relatively centralized way. But then with the Tea Party movement and the Tea Party caucus in the House of Representatives, they challenged that centralized leadership, and it created a lot of instability in what had been a relatively predictable system before. They challenged a lot of norms in Washington that had kind of allowed for more coherence to policymaking. So then in turn, there was kind of a corresponding revolt in the Democratic coalition with more of the socialist wing of the party. Generally the urban professionals and the students kind of were unhappy that there wasn't as much social spending as they wanted, that there was not as much government action on established issues like student debt, the cost of living, etc. And they kind of clashed with the more center-left wing of the party. And that, of course, manifested most obviously in the 2016 Democratic nomination process for president, where Bernie Sanders really tapped a lot of that emotion amongst that sort of suppressed wing of the party that hadn't really had as much of a voice for a long time, and clashed with Hillary Clinton and her more center-left wing of the party. And, with the Republican Party, their Tea Party wing, in so much as you can say that's represented by Trump, it's kind of not, but that wing kind of defeated the establishment Republican wing in the 2016 nomination process and kind of beat them. Whereas in the Democrats' case, the establishment wing was able to kind of suppress that revolt and go with an establishment candidate. And we kind of saw the result of that. It didn't really end well for the Democrats. But we're probably going to see more of those kinds of clashes, not less, going forward. Because a lot of those political factions are very discontented, and they're going to try to find new partners. It's going to look weird to outsiders because in the U.S. we have a two-party system. So people always ask, why don't you just vote for new parties? Well, that's not really how the political system here works. I mean, here, if you're a different distinctive political faction, you don't found your own party. You try to join one of the existing coalitions in among the Republicans or Democrats. And the way you get your policies represented in governance is to kind of condition your support for the party in question on them doing this, that, or the other once they're in power. And then you kind of evaluate how they do, and then depending on how they do, you'll support different candidates in the primary process. So if there's a candidate who you've helped vote in who doesn't really perform to your liking, you can support a primary challenger later on and get them thrown out and have your guy put in, and then hopefully they do better.
Well, if there are people outside the U.S. who don't know, we do have other parties. The Libertarian Party and the Green Party are the next biggest ones, but they're both much smaller than the Republican and Democratic parties. And if there's a candidate from one of those parties who has a pretty good shot at election, they'll typically get pushed into their respective big party. So like Ron Paul was a candidate who had a lot of momentum in his campaign, and he's libertarian, but that aligns with a lot of stuff that conservatives feel. So as a Republican candidate, he was kind of viable. He didn't end up winning, but it was that process of if he had a good enough chance, then he would increase his chances by running as Republican, even though that's not precisely his party. It's the next closest party that's more viable.
Yeah, that's actually basically what Donald Trump and some of his, his constituents did. That Donald Trump's brand of nationalism was kind of alien to the Republican Party. It was more of an interventionist, anti-free trade, not not anti-business per se, but maybe anti-free trade and business skeptical, or maybe anti-big business. Let's put it like that. So that was kind of an alien perspective for the Republican Party, but even though that was alien to the party and its ideology, they were still able to basically hijack the party. Well, maybe hijack's not the right word, but they were still able to become the dominant faction in the party by basically participating in that primary process and winning enough votes to have Trump become the nominee in 2016. So by participating in the process in that vein, they were basically able to change what the party stood for. And that kind of internal change is more how policy change happens in the U.S. as opposed to voting for different parties like you might in a proportionally representative political system. So basically, the short version of all that is that all political systems have coalition building. If you have a proportional representative system, generally that coalition building is very explicitly done by individual political parties, whereas in the U.S., with the two-party system, coalition building is done more implicitly amongst political movements and groups rather than explicit political parties. It's the same kind of political activity happening on a different level and in a different way. That's basically the Cliff Notes version.
In some previous episodes, we've talked about some other countries that have the opposite problem of having too many political parties and none of them is powerful enough to do anything.
Yeah, Brazil was kind of a case in point of that. They've got a multitude of political parties in Brazil, and because of that, coalition building is extremely difficult. And political coalitions in Brazil tend to be somewhat fragile as a result, to say nothing of raucous. Yeah, having lots of political parties is definitely no guarantee of stable government or even necessarily representative government. It's entirely possible to have a minority government in a political system where there's lots of political parties. Spain had that recently with the conservatives in power, even though the Conservative Party was a minority, because no other party could build a coalition that had a majority. And so the way the Spanish Constitution was written, power just defaulted to the incumbent party, which was the conservatives. So that's why I think his name was Prime Minister Rajoy. Maybe somebody from Spain can correct me on that, but he was in power a lot longer than he might have otherwise been on account of that fact. So in the same way that a multi-party system could have gridlock because nobody's willing or able to build a coalition, we're seeing a similar process in the US with its two-party system, where a lot of those different political factions are having trouble building coalitions and maintaining coalition. That's kind of what happened in 2016 to a degree. Sort of that left wing of the Democratic Party kind of defected, or at least abstained from the vote because they didn't like Hillary Clinton. And so that kind of was a contributing factor to the outcome of the election. There was lots of factors. That's a whole other conversation we could get into, why the 2016 election kind of had the outcome it did. But nominally, that's just an example of how factions compete with each other and interact in the U.S. political system. Again, I'm not sure. Oh, that's what it was. Where's the Democratic Party going? Is it going to be more socialist, etc.? It'll probably lean more to the left over time, but I don't think it's ever going to be explicitly socialist or probably even socially democratic. And how do I think it will affect our republic? I think, in general, both parties are going to go through a process of redefining themselves and their respective political coalition. And I think how that process pans out is going to be a lot more important to how the U.S. Republic and U.S. political system is affected in the future than, rather specifically how socialist one party or the other becomes. So I think that's kind of the overarching issue that I would watch there. Let's see. Do you think the government should take on the Puerto Rico debt? They are American citizens, but it looks like it's just for certain moments. For instance, the army. But on the debt talk, it looks like they are not part of this country. The debt of U.S. territories is not U.S. debt. It's not federal debt. And I mean, even if they were a state, that would still kind of apply. I mean, the difference is not that states can have their debt assumed by the federal government and territories can't. I mean, either way, the federal government could hypothetically step in and assume it. But it's not, the difference is more, has to do with bankruptcy, per se. Whatever the territorial equivalent of that would be. Basically, if you're a state and you default on your debt, you can structure a debt settlement in which that debt is reduced. That's a legal option available to states within the federal system, within the federal legal superstructure. U.S. territories are not subject to that same legal superstructure. They have a separate set of laws and legal structure that kind of applies to them under the rubric of U.S. law. And part of that structure is that they cannot restructure debt in the same way that a state can. Basically, they can't get debt forgiveness legally. Hypothetically, they could negotiate it individually with their creditors, but they can't refer their debt to the legal system and use a legal process to force a debt restructuring on their debtors in the way that a state can. So that's more the difference there. Again, whether or not the U.S. should take on Puerto Rico's debt is a subjective question. There are different opinions on that. Some people think the U.S. government has treated Puerto Rico unfairly and think that it should try to do more to alleviate that debt load. Other people think that Puerto Rico's debt problems are its own problems and it's their own fault and that they should kind of deal with that themselves. I think the U.S. government has contributed to the solution to the problem by, and this is highly debatable, but the action the federal government took was to basically appoint people to Puerto Rico's government to handle their debt in the stead of elected officials in Puerto Rico's government. And I think they ended up imposing some amount of austerity policies to try to as a way to address the debt problems, which is not really an ideal way to deal with them. That's kind of a blunt force approach. I'm sure people in Puerto Rico would have appreciated a more finessed solution to the problem, but nominally that's how the U.S. government responded to the issue. So it's not the case that the U.S. government has done nothing, but it has not assumed the debt, and debatably the solution that was implemented was not really a particularly good one. It's certainly not an ideal one. Let's see. Opinions on the recent Ilhan Omar controversy. This wasn't the basketball player, was it? I don't really follow sports much.
Sports.
Ah, okay. This is the Congresswoman, Ilhan Omar. I'm not sure what the controversy they're referring to is. Was this her bitching out Trump when she was inaugurated? Because I think there was a congressperson who used some somewhat undiplomatic language when they were being sworn in at one point, but I don't know if this is that person. Yeah, I would ask for some specification on that point, because I'm not sure what specifically the controversy is. Controversy. There's been no shortage of dramatic political stories in the U.S. over the past few months, so you're going to have to elaborate on controversy. For those who don't follow U.S. politics, just to give an example of the kind of stuff that goes on here, the kind of circus-like political atmosphere we have, there's been 3 successive scandals in the state of Virginia over the past month that have kind of rocked Virginian politics, and all of them, I think all of them have had to do with blackface. For those of you not familiar with that, blackface is when you basically use paint or coloring of some kind to color your face black so that you can, well, historically it was so that you would look like a black person. And the historical connotation relates to what were called minstrel shows, which were sort of late 19th century, early 20th century shows in which people would act like, well, pretend to be black people and then act out various skits and, comedic sketches and that kind of thing. Generally in ways that were not terribly flattering to black people. But there was kind of an implicit racial connotation to them that did not reflect well on the African American population. And so blackface in turn has a very racist connotation in US culture. And so when anybody is sort of caught, quote unquote, with blackface, then that tends to go over very poorly. Even when the person in question is not a politician, especially when they are. And in Virginia, there's a couple of politicians. I think the governor was one, and then I think maybe the vice governor. Yeah, that's probably not the right name for them, but both of them had photos from their high school years back in, I think, the 1950s or 60s or something emerge in which they were wearing blackface. And so that turned into a big scandal, and people were asking them to step down, and they said no, which is a little unusual. Generally, the move is to just kind of resign, because generally the political pressure brought to bear is pretty immense, because that's a very touchy subject. But they're trying to kind of weather the storm. Part of the reason, I think, is because they're Democrats. And that kind of gives them a little more legal, well, not legal, but political leeway that they might not otherwise have. But it's still immensely controversial, even for a Democrat. And so that's turned into a big political shitstorm in Virginia. So there are two people who got caught up in that, and then there was a third scandal that I don't remember quite what was about. I think maybe that was the governor, actually. I think maybe that third scandal was the governor. But I think he actually was black himself. But I don't think you get in trouble for blackface if you're black. Somebody can correct me on that if I'm wrong.
Well, that fits with the general trend of you're allowed to make fun of your own demographic rather than other ones.
Yeah, that's going to bug me, though. What is the Governor of Virginia scandal? What was that? Oh, maybe that was the black... All right, well, now I'm confused. Basically, there are three scandals. Two of them have to do with blackface, and there was a third one that had to do with something else.
Fairfax had sexual misconduct allegations.
That's what it was. That's what it was. Thank you.
Thank you, Ron.
So all three of those have hit over the past month in Virginia, and they've kind of been in the headlines a lot over here in the U.S., among all the other shit that's been happening. So when you refer to a given controversy, you might have to specify a bit to jog my memory. We tend to blow through them pretty quickly over these days. Let's see. In an age without a real, quote-unquote, gold standard, what are the biggest influences on the worth of currency, like the strength of the euro versus the USD or the fluctuation of the pound, etc.? Value is determined mostly by markets. And so that's kind of the lazy economist way of saying it's determined by the value, sort of different things, but in general, the balance of exports and imports. There's even that is a gross simplification, but in general, that's how it works. If you export more, the value of your currency generally goes up. When you import more, or export less, in turn, your currency will be valued less. But there's a lot of other things that impact the value of a currency, like geopolitical risk, or just political risk. Venezuelans can tell you about that. There's also just things like policies, regulations, etc. There's a lot of things that are not necessarily directly related to an economy that will impact the value of a currency. But in general, the principal driver of currency value is the underlying economy that is using the currency in question. The total amount of productivity and production, exports, imports, etc. In the case of the U.S., this is actually a subject we've talked about a fair amount before, and I think this is one of the things we talked about a lot when we first started up this segment, was people would ask, about whether the value of the dollar was based exclusively on oil, because that's kind of a long-running notion that, the value of the US dollar depends exclusively on the petrodollar. The fact that oil is priced in dollars sort of floats the value of the currency, and without that, the US currency would plummet in value with very deleterious effects on the US economy. And that this is the reason that the US is so interventionist in the Middle East, so that it can prevent countries from selling oil in something other than dollars. This is basically just a myth. The value of the US dollar is not tied to oil or is the sale of oil in dollars. It helps a bit, but it's not really a significant driver. It's not a significant determinant. There's a whole other history there of how oil interacts with the US economy and the dollar. That stems more from political crises in the 1970s that stemmed from the oil embargo after the 1973 Yom Kippur War. The oil embargo really did a number on a number of economies in the developed world. Inflation spiked, economic growth stalled out. That's kind of one of the core causes of stagflation in the 70s. And the value of the dollar at that time was already in bad shape because of endemic, not endemic, but high U.S. government spending on Great Society programs and the Vietnam War. And that was a big problem because the Bretton Woods system at the time tried to fix everybody's exchange rate. And the U.S. was not really respecting that because it was spending so much money, and the value of the dollar in turn was being depressed. The U.S. position was that Europeans, who were kind of the other major component in the Bretton Woods system, should in turn devalue their currencies as well. But a lot of countries didn't want to do that, especially Germany, because they didn't want the inflationary pressure. So there was kind of a tug of war between the U.S. and the Europeans about how to adjust the Bretton Woods system, who should do what to try to maintain the system. And eventually the whole thing just collapsed because nobody could reach any kind of consensus. And the result of that was a sudden floating of currencies. And because the US dollar had been overvalued because of the fixed exchange rate regime under the Bretton Woods system, the US dollar plummeted in value. And that, combined with the oil crisis, was pretty ball-breaking for the US budget. So the Nixon administration went to the Middle East. This is all very simplified, by the way, so this is not like a complete history of the issue in question. But
this is the issue in 10 minutes or less.
Yeah, there you go. I'm still going to do that. That's still in the cards. That podcast series of 10-minute episodes. I haven't forgotten about that. But nominally, this is the outline of the issue in the 70s, from which this myth kind of emerged, I think. What happened was the Nixon administration pressured the Saudis to stop the oil embargo because it was so damaging. And eventually just outright threatened to invade them if they didn't end it. Well, he didn't outright threaten, but it was implied. There was an implied threat of violence. And the Saudis kind of read that message and concurred, and eventually an agreement was reached in which the Saudis would channel petrodollars back into U.S. debt and would start pumping out oil again and reduce the price. Now, it was the buying of the debt with the petrodollars that was the more relevant aspect of that negotiation. They did, as part of that agreement, agree to start selling oil in dollars again. They had stopped doing that when the dollar started devaluing before, in I think the early 70s. I think they did it briefly in the late 60s as well, but the early 70s is when they did it and stuck with it. Specifically because the dollar had been devaluing and they wanted to maintain the value of their exports. So what happened was they were forced, well, not forced entirely, but they were coerced into pricing the oil in dollars again. But the effect of that was mostly meant to be a short-term effect. That was meant to be a short-term stimulus for the U.S. economy because it meant that oil was temporarily cheaper. But it was not meant as a way to permanently float the value of the U.S. currency because other countries around the world needed to use dollars. That was meant as a short-term stimulus. The more important aspect of the deal, again, was the buying of debt. Because the U.S. was producing a lot of debt at the time to pay for sundry government spending programs, again, mostly social spending in the Vietnam War. And it was having trouble finding liquidity in international markets to pay for that. So the petrodollars relieved that pressure and dealt with an imminent debt crisis in the United States that was kind of emerging at that time. Keep in mind, this was only a few decades after World War II, and international markets had not really fully recovered from World War II. International markets had not really been allowed to recover because of all the centralized planning that kind of defined international finance under the Bretton Woods agreement. Even if they hadn't, you could argue it still wouldn't have fully recovered just because so much damage had been done during the war. But regardless, the point is that there just was not a lot of liquidity in international markets relative to what there is, say, today. Today, liquidity in international markets is ridiculous. It's massive. But in the 70s, it still wasn't really quite there yet. And so, in turn, if you wanted to spend a lot of money and borrow a lot of money, you couldn't really do that as easily, which is kind of where the U.S. debt problem came from. So the petrodollar agreement that was made with the Saudis, among other, Gulf oil producers, that was meant more to address that specifically. But people who think that the dollar depends on oil and oil being priced in dollars for its value, they tend to cite the fact that the U.S. coerced the Saudis into pricing oil in dollars again, when really that was meant more as, one, a temporary thing, and two, more just a reversion to the norm. It had been priced in dollars before for a long time, and it was just pulled, it was stopped just as a temporary measure while the U.S. dollar was devaluing. Again, the value of the U.S. dollar depends a lot more on, one, U.S. exports, which are still pretty strong, contrary to popular opinion. The U.S. still produces quite a bit of stuff. And two, it stems from the U.S. as an attractive market for investment. And we've talked about this before. The U.S. has an excellent combination of, one, growth, and two, stability. If you're looking for a safe environment in which to invest your money, generally you have to trade off some amount in returns, your rate of interest, your rate of return on your investment, because generally safe investments are generally not very pro-growth, high-growth investments. In turn, if you want to take on more risk, you can go for a more high-growth investment, but generally, geopolitically speaking, if you're looking at different countries to invest in, higher growth opportunities are kind of offset by risk from shaky political systems or corruption, what have you. But in the U.S., we kind of have a decent balance of both because we have strong rule of law. You generally can be very confident that your money, your investment is not going to be arbitrarily confiscated or nationalized. But in turn, because the U.S. is more free market system, generally investments have a relatively higher rate of return here than in equivalent developed economies. So together, that makes for a very strong combo, and it makes the U.S. a very attractive environment for investment. And that's why one of the U.S.'s top exports beyond, equipment, actual tangible things, is actually investment. Technically, when somebody in another country invests in your country's economy, that technically counts as an export. Kind of like how tourism technically counts as an export. You're not really sending a good overseas, but when people come from overseas and spend money in your economy, that is technically an export. So a similar dynamic works with finance. So that's a big part of why the US dollar has a lot of value. Beyond just the export of goods and services from the US, money coming into the US also props up the value of the US dollar because it's an attractive investment location. So all of that is much more important to the value of the dollar than, say, oil being priced in dollars or the petrodollar, in general. So that's a very long-winded answer to that question. I hope I got to the gist of. I hope I satisfactorily addressed that. Just there are a lot of other factors involved with that determine the value of currencies and forex markets. As a follow-up to the question about democracy, what do you think of a proposed electronic voting system which allow a form of direct democracy? In such a system, a voter would vote directly on an issue or grant their vote to anyone else, forming a chain of voting power. The idea is that a voter who felt that the vote they lent to someone else was cast against their interests could immediately rescind that privilege, giving a strong incentive for the vote aggregators to vote according to the preferences of their supporters. I'm going to have to read that again, so give me a minute. Oh, okay. I see. I haven't read a whole lot about this, so I can't really speak particularly intelligibly about it. I'll try anyway, just because I don't know isn't a very satisfactory answer. But yeah, that is one way that you could do it, but the problem with direct democracy in general, taking the big picture view, direct democracy is only as effective as the voters. And voters, unfortunately, are not always up to snuff, so to speak. They tend to be pretty contradictory in terms of the things that they want. And a good example of that is California having, in the same year, separate referendas, one requiring a balanced budget, while at the same time expanding social spending in another referendum. Mind you, spending was already too high. The budget was already unbalanced, so voting for both at the same time is basically asking for two things that you can't have at the same time. So contradictory voting like that and contradictory interests, that kind of creates a problem in direct democracy. And it's more workable with smaller populations, because generally things like that can be negotiated out more thoroughly. It's more easy to kind of bring them up and reach a consensus. But in a really large country like, say, the United States, which has 300 million plus people, it becomes very unwieldy. That in general is why we have a representative democracy instead of direct democracy. It's just having 300 million people vote on every policy would become very problematic very quickly. And that's to say nothing of the problem that comes with framing. If you're going to have a vote on something, how do you frame the vote? And that could be a problem. You could abstract the vote in such a way that you're basically voting broad powers to the government, voting broad discretionary power to do this, that, or the other. And that could be very problematic depending on how it's worded. You could in turn have votes that are very specific, but the votes could then become so specific that you would need a whole series of votes in order to construct an actual whole policy. And that could be very, very time consuming if you're doing that for every single policy issue, of which there are a lot in a country of 300 million people. So unless you want the entire population to be constantly voting on things, that may not be very wieldy, and that may never be very practical, rather. So yes, this proposed system of electronic voting, this proposed system of direct democracy could hypothetically work. This particular proposal kind of addresses some of the concerns I brought up by allowing the pooling of votes, in which you can kind of give your vote to someone and allow them to kind of vote in your stead. But then the problem with that is the same problem you have now, which is that people can promise to do one thing and then do another. You could argue that the process of correcting that is much faster than via elections, because in this case, you can immediately pull your vote and give it to someone else. But then you're back to the original problem I mentioned earlier about direct democracy, which is, how do you manage a multitude of votes or a narrow set of votes that give too broad a set of discretionary powers to government? I mean, ultimately, you're kind of just playing whack-a-mole when it comes to trying to improve representation and democracy. There are little things you can do at the margins, but big sweeping changes like this, they don't really address the fundamental problems, per se. You push on one part of the problem and then it just crops up in another place. The underlying issue is that the United States is a big country, has a lot of divergent interests, and it's just inherently difficult to navigate and negotiate those interests. And there's no political system you're probably going to be able to devise that's going to deal with that. Having an electronic voting system where you can kind of give out your vote like that, that might expedite the process. That could be a good change, but it doesn't really address that fundamental underlying issue. And I think so long as that's the case, you're probably not going to see the kind of improvement that you're kind of really looking for with a big change like that. Doesn't mean it's not worth pursuing. It could be worth the effort, but I don't think it's going to dramatically change outcomes such as they are at this point. Interesting tactical move, but probably not an efficacious strategic move. And that's kind of the short version of that answer. And I'll add again here, I'm not a poli-sci guy. I haven't read a whole lot about all these different alternative voting systems, electoral systems, etc. So I'm not the best guy to ask. But if you are going to ask me, I will give you an answer. So that's kind of roughly my take on it. It could be worth it, but I don't think it's going to really solve the fundamental problems. I don't think it's going to solve the big problems, so to speak. You would still have problems of, you would still have the principal agent problem that we have now. You would just kind of try to, the new process you propose would just kind of deal with it more quickly. But I don't know that it would really fundamentally solve things, because fundamentally there are real differences in voters and voting interests and voting preferences in the US. And so long as that's the case, you're still going to have a lot of division and a lot of polarization. Hopefully that ameliorates with time as the body politic kind of matures, so to speak. We've talked about that before too, how one of the possibly one of the reasons for the amount of polarization we have is that more of the public is involved in politics than before, because more of the public is more well off, has higher incomes, and has more access to information because of technology. And because more of the population is involved in politics, relatively more people are in turn getting involved who are not necessarily familiar with some of the software that goes into democratic governance, some of the democratic norms that govern forbearance in a democratic society. You know, if you're a politician, historically, you would come to Washington and you would kind of either already be familiar with those or you would be acculturated. But what do you do when there's relatively more direct democracy before, where you have a big chunk of the population getting involved that isn't really that familiar with those ideas and isn't really readily acculturated to them. I might be making up a word there, but I think you know what I mean. I think that's just a difficult process that has to be worked out over the long run. We'll kind of evolve more maturity in that regard, and then eventually that'll kind of also help reduce polarization. But in a country of 300 million people, I reiterate, you're going to have some big major differences. And no matter what kind of system you have, you're going to have to face that. You know, you're going to have a compromise, and it's probably going to be compromises people will not like. You know, again, I mean, we've talked before about how the ideal system for any large country is a decentralized political system, because a decentralized political system smooths over those differences. You know, if the centralized national government does not have as much power, there's not as much to argue about, because there's not as much that the government can do. If you devolve more power to state governments or local governments, it's much easier for those communities, you know, those body politics, to reach a consensus, because generally there's not as much of a diversity of opinion at the state or local level. Generally, it's much easier to reach a compromise at those levels. So in that sense, that's how you kind of deal with polarization. You just kind of outsource it to a lower level of government where it's not as much of a problem in the first place. Again, that's debatable. Different people will have different opinions on that, different preferences. But that's probably the only way you can directly significantly reduce polarization. There's going to be trade-offs in that, but again, that wasn't the question. The question was thoughts on this alternative voting system. I guess I've kind of belabored that, so I'll just let it go. I don't know that I can really add a whole lot more of substance. I can drone on, but that's probably not helping anybody. Let's see, thoughts on Bitcoin. We haven't had a cryptocurrency question in a while, have we, Neuro? It's been a while. Well, I guess I would just add what we've talked about before, well, let me also add, I'm not an expert in cryptocurrency. I don't really know a whole lot about it. My perspective is very much an economist's perspective, which tends to be a bit skeptical and critical of cryptocurrency as an alternative currency. But then I would also add that I don't really know enough about cryptocurrencies, well, specific cryptocurrencies, to comment on any of them. So I don't really know enough about what distinguishes Bitcoin from other cryptocurrencies to tell you what the advantages or disadvantages would be. I would say, and this isn't anything new for long-time listeners, but the economist kind of perspective is that cryptocurrency is not really a viable alternative currency. It's just too unstable and too unpredictable, and there's not enough of an institutional framework to kind of make it a stable enough rival to more established currencies, for which there are more legal protections and more relevant legal regulatory apparatus that you can kind of lean on. I will say, though, that the underlying technology is a different conversation. Blockchain technology does have potential applications that could reverberate through the economy, that they could be substantive. But as for specific cryptocurrencies as alternative currencies, probably not very efficacious. It'll probably just be principally a source for people who want to buy things without leaving a paper trail, or people who are looking for some speculative investment. I think I did have something in my notes about cryptocurrencies, though. There was something in the news about JP Morgan creating their own cryptocurrency. And I thought that was an interesting example of blockchain technology being applied in an interesting, innovative new way. And so you might see something in future, you might see more examples like JP Morgan's cryptocurrency rather than more, what would you call it, initial currency offerings of new sort of traditional cryptocurrencies as we've seen before up till now. Let me see if I can find that. Oh yeah, here it is. So the way JP Morgan is using it, it's not going to be publicly available. So it's not going to be a publicly traded currency like Bitcoin or Ethereum or any of those. Rather, their conception of the cryptocurrency, I think they're calling them JPM coin. You're only going to be able to trade it on their blockchain network, which I think is called Quorum. And the idea is that if you have an account, if you have deposits with JP Morgan, you can take that money and exchange it for JPM coin rather. And the reason they're doing that is because they want to try, well, for one, it's an experiment, but the idea is that you could do business with other account holders in JP Morgan faster and without as much of a delay, since normally if you do a money transfer or have a transaction, it takes JP Morgan time to kind of process and verify that transaction. But with a cryptocurrency, you could hypothetically just forego all of that verification stuff and just use the blockchain. You can use the blockchain itself as the recording device and use that for verification. But it's going to happen within a very narrow environment, specifically Quorum, their own sort of little network there. And it's only going to be among and between account holders of JP Morgan. And specifically, I should add, not everybody will be able to qualify for it. This is going to be more something for institutional investors. These are major financial entities that have very large accounts and do a lot of business with JP Morgan or through JP Morgan. So the idea is that those businesses will be able to more quickly and efficiently get through those transactions by using blockchain technology. And if they ever want to use the money for something else or want to do business with an entity outside of JP Morgan, they can always just convert those Bitcoins back to dollars and then do business accordingly outside of the Quorum environment. So that's kind of what they have in mind. Some people are a little skeptical that that's kind of efficacious, but we'll see. It's a kind of a big experiment they're running, and it's something you can kind of watch if you're interested in blockchain technology. And I suspect in the future, blockchain will kind of move more in that direction than towards the direction of like an actual currency that you could use. That seems like the more likely avenue. Are we doing okay on time?
Mm-hmm. I think Mus is missing, so we're not going to be getting questions in. But I think we've been on for a bit. How many questions do we have in the queue?
We've got a couple more.
Okay. Could probably do those and then a few more. I'm pretty good energy-wise. So.
Oh, I'm fine too. I just wasn't really keeping track of time. What, I guess we've been on 2.5 hours? 2 hours, maybe?
Yeah.
Something to that effect. Yeah, just let me know. Yeah, give me a flag or something. Let's see. Do you feel that North Korea is stalling out with current visits with Trump in order to get their missiles advanced further? Or do you feel that Kim is currently being sincere and trying to work with the U.S.? That's a tough call. It's not really clear. Probably he's stalling, I would suspect. That would be my guess. In general, that's kind of been the pattern with North Korea whenever it's tried to negotiate with the US or other outside powers vis-a-vis its nuclear program. They've always tended to kind of drag things out and reach a superficial compromise that they end up kind of breaking later on. And then that kind of leads to a new crisis, and the whole thing kind of starts over again. So this could well be similar to that. But again, North Korea is has an opaque political system, so you never really can tell. It's hard to judge. So I can't really say for sure that they're just kind of playing for time. I don't know that they necessarily need to play for time. They've already got nuclear weapons. Everybody knows they have nuclear weapons, so there's not necessarily great benefit in continuing to drag things out. It could be that they're trying to develop a nuclear missile, or rather develop a missile that has the range to hit the US and that can carry a nuclear weapon. That's something they've been working on for a while. That would obviously change the strategic calculus. It would give the North Korean government an extra layer of protection. It's one thing if you're threatening to nuke South Korea in the event of a war. It's another thing if you can actually hit the United States. So that might be a strategic edge they're kind of trying to push for, but at the same time, that is kind of a red line for the US, and it may be that as they get closer to it, US pressure will ramp up. And I think maybe they know that, in which case maybe they're doing all of this foot dragging for another reason. But if that's the case, I don't know what that reason would be. It may be that they're just trying to gain leverage in the negotiation to try to get as much as they can in terms of concessions from the United States as possible before they do eventually end up giving major concessions of their own, like giving up the nuclear program, shutting down facilities, etc., etc. It's really just too hard to tell. I mean, it's really, with an opaque regime like that, it's anybody's guess. The Trump administration obviously thinks that it's worth a try. Maybe it will be. It's hard to say. They've certainly kind of maintained the threat of violence kind of in their back pocket. They've never really fully moved away from that. So they can point to that as a kind of stick with their carrot of potential concessions. It seems pretty clear the North Korean government definitely wants the end, or at least the partial removal of sanctions before they start giving up anything in terms of nuclear concessions. That seems to be the one consistent thing we've seen out of the North Koreans in the negotiation thus far. And that's also been the one thing that the Trump administration has been very explicit about not giving up. They want to see movements on denuclearization first, before any kind of sanctions relief happens. So it may be that the North Korean government is just maneuvering to try to get some sanctions relief sooner and earlier, and more of it, before it starts giving up concessions in terms of denuclearization. That could be the case. That's maybe my best guess at this point. I would probably have to go with that. But again, pure speculation on my part. Who knows? And what people think about the efficacy of the negotiations and whether or not they're a good idea in the first place is going to vary from person to person. In case you have paid attention to European politics, what do you think about the current right-oriented parties rising in Germany, Austria, and Italy, AfD, FPO, Liga Nord, and the thoughts of leaving the EU brought up by many countries, primarily the UK, Italy, and Germany, and what are the consequences of those countries leaving for the rest of the EU? All right, multi-part question here. In case you have paid attention to Europe, what do you think? All right, what do I think about the current right-oriented parties rising in Germany, Austria, and Italy? Some are rising more than others. Obviously, in Italy, they're in power, so they've risen quite a bit. In Italy's case, though, there's a lot of dysfunction because the Liga Norte and the Five Star Party, those are kind of very different ideologies. They have very different perspectives. Liga Norte is more right-wing, and Five Star is kind of more left-wing. So right away, they've kind of got some big policy differences. The things that they've managed to agree on are just sort of general populist type things, like challenging the European Union, running budget deficits, stuff like that. Anti-immigration policies as well. That's been another big thing for them. But I don't know really what else they can do besides. I don't know what else they can build consensus on between themselves beyond the most generic of populist policies. They can grandstand, they can make a big hue and cry, they can complain, but in terms of actual policy making, in terms of actually addressing the economic and political problems that Italy has, I don't know how much they can really do about it. And I think that's going to kind of be more of a problem for them as time goes on and the constituents get more restive about the lack of real progress. You know, maybe they can offer something that kind of alleviates that, but I haven't seen anything in that vein yet, so we'll see. But in Austria, they're more marginal. You know, I know that there is, I think, a far-right president, technically, right now. But I don't think the far-right has really gained much traction beyond that. No. I think, did Austria have a coalition government that had them? Center-right and far-right? Maybe somebody from Austria can kind of clear that up for me, but they're not in power, let me put it like that. And I don't really see them as I don't really see them having the momentum to gain a lot more power going forward. And I would say the same about the AfD in Germany. Their trajectory is not really great. You know, they've gotten a lot further than anybody really gave them credit for, or maybe more accurately, anybody thought they would. But I don't know really how much further growth they can really get now. Because the big issue for all of these parties, and all of these different countries we're talking about, was mostly immigration. You know, specifically the Syria immigration crisis in, what I want to say, 2014, kind of around there. That was more the crux of the populist explosion in European politics in that era. So now that that's kind of abated a bit and is not much of an issue, I don't know really what else they can kind of point to. You know, there's economic malaise in a lot of places. They can point to that, but they don't really have good solutions for that per se. You know, some of them have very particular solutions they want to implement that they think would solve it, but generally there's not enough political support for dramatic reforms like that. You know, and in a case like Italy, where you have kind of a right and left-wing party in the same government, major reforms like that would be extremely difficult to implement. I know they're going to experiment with like a basic income in Italy, but that's not really substantive. I don't know how sustainable it's going to be going forward, and I don't know how widespread they're going to be able to really make it amongst the broader population. It's going to be very expensive regardless, and Italy's budget is not really in great shape. So that kind of remains to be seen whether or not that'll really have the desired impact. Even if it doesn't have the desired economic impact of kind of rejuvenating the Italian economy, it might have a sufficiently positive political impact to alleviate populist pressure. But then at that point, that kind of takes the wind out of their sails, and that kind of gives more power to the status quo establishment parties, if indeed things did get substantially better. So I just don't really think the populist movement in Europe really has legs over the long term. That's kind of my principal criticism of them at this point. You know, they are tapping a very real political demand in Europe for change. But it's not clear to me that any of the populist parties really have an actual vision for change that they can realistically operationalize and implement in a way that actually has desirable substantive outcomes. You know, at this point, it is kind of more political theater than political substance on the part of a lot of politically populist parties in Europe. So for that reason, I'm a little skeptical where they can go beyond being an adjutant. You know, maybe a coalition partner in Austria, you know, maybe occasionally get power in an unwieldy coalition like in Italy. Or maybe kind of an ankle biter like in Germany, where they can kind of influence from the margins, but otherwise can't really get power. I don't think they can do more than that. I think they've kind of hit their ceiling. Maybe I'm wrong. That could easily be. Maybe there's something else dramatic that happens in Europe that kind of propels them forward. But for now, I think they're kind of reaching their limit. You know, you kind of see that to a degree with the yellow vest protests in France. You know, for a while they were very strong, and they've kind of petered out with time. They're still there. They're still protesting. But they kind of had their moment, and now it's kind of, the wind is kind of out of their sails, so to speak. They don't really have an obvious direction to go in, given the political plurality of the movement. There's so many different groups who want different things. How do you reconcile them all and kind of push towards a common goal? They kind of can't, and as a result, they're kind of losing political effectiveness. You know, different parts of the movement have broken off and gone back to different political parties, and you're kind of left with a disoriented, incoherent core. And I suspect that's kind of going to be the fate of the broader populist movement in Europe. if indeed the establishment parties are able to kind of navigate this moment in history successfully. Maybe they can't, but for now, they're more or less doing okay. It doesn't seem like there's a populist revolt that's going to happen. So that kind of leads into the next part of the question. Thoughts of leaving the EU brought up by many countries, primarily these countries, and what would be the consequences of those countries leaving? I don't think anybody's going to leave the European Union, except the UK. But that's because they had a referendum, and we've talked at length about referendums on here before. They're not really a good idea. It's just to kind of summarize previous criticism. If you have a close referendum where it's like 51% win, or whether one side wins by 51%, it doesn't matter what happens after that. Half the country is going to be pissed off at the government, and you're going to have social and political instability. It's just a very blunt political instrument to deal with political disagreements. It is in general better to try to compromise and reach a consensus in which everybody's on board with a policy, rather than try to force a policy on one half of the population that you know prima facie that they're going to do everything they can to undermine and eventually reverse. That's why referendum's a bad idea, and that's why Brexit has kind of been a bit of a mess for the UK, to put it mildly. So in turn, unless other countries start doing something similar, and given the UK's experience, I don't think they will, it's kind of poisoned the well, so to speak, more likely Eurosceptic movements are going to move away from exiting the European Union as a policy platform. And you've already kind of seen that. A lot of Eurosceptic parties that had kind of been talking about it have moved away from that rhetoric as they've kind of, one, gotten closer to power, and two, seen how unpopular Brexit has been in Europe. In general, the effect of Brexit and the dysfunction of Brexit has been to kind of bolster the perception of European Union institutions amongst Europeans. That's not true for all of Europeans. I'm sure we've got a few listening who don't think like that. But in general, it's kind of reinforced the EU a bit, so populist parties have backed off of outright exiting the European Union as an actual policy. Now they're kind of shifting more towards reform and changing how the European Union works rather than destroying it outright. Let's see. Now, as for the consequences of major countries like Italy, Germany, or France leaving the European Union, obviously that would be pretty catastrophic for the European Union, since those are pretty much the core countries of the European Union. Without them, it kind of loses a lot of its draw. A lot of the attraction of being in the European Union is that you have access to large, prosperous markets. And if the large, prosperous markets are not in the European Union, then you don't really have nearly as much incentive to join. So that would probably trigger a cascade of departures from the EU to the point where it would probably be replaced by a series of free trade agreements of one sort or another, negotiated bilaterally amongst different countries in Europe. Some people would love that. That's a policy objective for some people in Europe. But in general, I don't think there's enough political support for that outcome to make it really viable. I don't think it would be a good prediction to make if you're looking to forecast European politics over the next 10, 20 years. Let's see. How do you understand blockchain to be different from Bitcoin? If a blockchain-based digital currency is centralized, how is that different from existing bank deposits or online wallets like PayPal?
Finally, we get a crypto question. It's been a while.
Surely it's Bitcoin's decentralized nature and the lack of rent extraction from banks that provide its value, rather than the ability to just have digital money. For a lot of people who love Bitcoin, that is exactly what the value of digital currency is. But there's not really enough of those people to make it viable. Right now, Bitcoin and cryptocurrency as a market is pretty much just people who don't trust banks. There's some other people who kind of use it for other reasons, but it's not really a substantive enough part of the, what would you call it, the overarching economy to really make it, to say that it's accepted. And it's too kind of unstable right now for it to become accepted. So I think there's just a clear block, a clear limit to how much it will be incorporated into the overarching economy. So how would I understand blockchain to be different from Bitcoin? Bitcoin is a specific cryptocurrency that uses blockchain technology. But blockchain technology can be used for other things besides currency or cryptocurrency. You can use it as a public ledger, so to speak. So, let's say that you have people who want to record property rights, the deeds to a house. Normally, you have to go through a pretty extensive an extensive procedure of paperwork and bureaucracy to kind of register your deed to a house if you buy one. But with blockchain technology, you could just do that publicly. You could just have that public blockchain, which is reliable and cannot be changed, and just change that. You can just add your lease, add your claim to a given lease on that blockchain, and then everybody can see that it's yours. And then if you ever sell your lease deed or whatever, that will be on the blockchain too, and everybody can verify it on the blockchain. So that's an alternative usage for blockchain technology. I'm not explaining it particularly well, but that is an alternative usage besides currency. And that alternative usage is probably more what blockchain technology will be used for going forward than currency. That's kind of more the point I was trying to make before. I wasn't trying to say that cryptocurrency doesn't have any value. I'm saying that, it does have value, but that's probably not going to be enough to project it into, propel it into mainstream usage amongst bigger, more established economic actors. Keep in mind also the fact that established currency is in the banking system, so to speak, that it is kind of a part of and subject to the financial sector isn't part of benefit. Yes, there is a cost to it, and that banks charge money and there's oversight and the government's kind of involved. But the upshot is that you get the benefit of regulatory oversight, you get certain regulatory protections, you get a lot of things and benefits from being involved in the legal sector and, in the legal above ground economy that you don't get being in this kind of a economic gray market like a lot of cryptocurrencies are in. And if you're a major economic actor, if you're a major institution like a bank or a merchant or, what would you call it, a wholesaler, major economic actors like that who have a lot of money to work with and, do a lot of transactions of large value very frequently, having a lot of protections and a strong legal framework is more important to you than not being subject to government oversight. Having that flexibility isn't really as valuable to those kinds of economic actors. And because those economic actors are disproportionately important to defining the norms of economic activity, for that reason alone, I would be skeptical that cryptocurrency would ever gain widespread usage. It's useful to a very particular subset of the economy and economic actors, but to most of the rest of the economy and economic actors, it just doesn't have that same utility. What's your opinion on U.S.-Israel relationship and treatment of Palestine? I'll go to Palestine question. Now, let's see how I can finagle this. What's your opinion on U.S.-Israel relationship and the treatment of Palestine? Okay. So the U.S.-Israel relationship right now is pretty good because the Trump administration is very, amiable towards the Netanyahu administration in Israel, and probably would be with any administration in Israel. The relationship for the Trump administration, I think, is mostly symbolic. Israel kind of has symbolic value in the U.S. politics, and I think the Trump administration wanted to engage with them more, just to kind of tap that, just to kind of scratch that, to appease that constituency in the U.S. that is very pro-Israel. But I don't think fundamentally U.S. policy has really changed that much vis-a-vis Israel. Nominally, the U.S. wants a peace deal between Israel and the Palestinians. The U.S. is still cooperating closely with Israel on regional security issues, up to a point anyway, in so much as the Trump administration does that. But overall, that doesn't really mark a significant departure. Some of the details of the Trump administration's particular approach are very different. Particularly recognizing Jerusalem as the capital and little things like that. But overall, those are not really like substantive changes. overall, the U.S. still technically doesn't recognize the settlements as legal. It still wants the settlement to be made between the Israelis and the Palestinians, and the U.S. is still largely unable to make any of that really happen. So, not really much has changed substantively. Superficially, yes, but not substantively. So I would say the U.S.-Israel relationship is as pretty much the same as it's ever been, but is superficially closer. As for the U.S., well, as for your opinion on the treatment of Palestine, I assume you're talking about the U.S. treatment of Palestine. The U.S. treatment of Palestine is to continue to pretend like it cares, which has pretty much been the long-standing policy. I think genuinely the U.S. government and the broader U.S. body politic does want a peace settlement. There is a desire for peace, but nobody has any idea how to make it happen. There's been successive attempts by successive administrations to take different approaches, and none of it ever really works. And in general, the problem has always been the tension between the Israelis and Palestinians themselves. There's an old saying here in the U.S., you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. And that very much applies to the Israel-Palestine issue. You can try as much as you want to do as much as you want to try to get them to sign a peace agreement, but if they themselves fundamentally don't want one, you can't really make them. So, in general, the equilibrium that is generally reached in any given administration, and is pretty much the equilibrium that's been reached in the Trump administration, is that you make an effort to get peace, it stalls out, and then you just kind of let it go. That's generally what happens. There was a big push in the Bush administration, and then nothing really came of it, and then it wasn't enough of a priority to warrant further effort, so they just kind of benched it. And the Trump administration made a similar effort. I think technically Jared Kushner is supposed to have like a big peace plan that he worked on or has or something to that effect. But nothing's come of that yet and probably won't. So I don't expect that's going to become an issue again anytime soon. I think they kind of shot their bolt, nothing happened, and so they're just going to be content with the status quo. Let's see. Had a couple things I wanted to get to besides questions, so I don't. What do you say about the last two here? Oh,
hang on.
I'll dig into them anyway. Did you see? Real quick, I'll try to get through them really quickly. Did you see that Russia is going to ask its ISPs to unplug from the global internet? A follow-up from last time when I asked whether he saw the internet bifurcating into an open Western one and a less free, more censored one. Yeah, I did see that. I actually did read an article about that. That was a test. I think that's a part of a test that the Russian government is running to test the resiliency of basically Russia's cyber environment. They want to see how what it would be like if Russia were to be attacked and cut off from the internet. And nominally, that's the rationalization. That's kind of the nominal excuse. But I also did read that it was kind of part of an overarching trend to try to build the necessary infrastructure to allow a kind of Russian equivalent to the Chinese Great Wall, to build a stronger centralized apparatus that could regulate and filter the internet as seen by Russians. So I did see that. That doesn't really change my answer from last time, though. I still don't think that there's going to be like one singular censored internet as a kind of alternative to the West. I think it's going to be more regionalized. I think you're going to end up with a lot of individual regional internets or even national internets in which everybody in that country has access to one type of internet, and then that's kind of filtered or blocked in other countries. So everybody will kind of have their own unique little internet experience. That seems more the direction that's trending. There could still be a global internet, but it could be significantly curtailed in the future as more and more regulations are passed. Even in relatively developed modern economies like, in Europe and whatnot, or Australia, definitely Australia, they're going to implement more and more rules and regulations that will kind of cut them off from the sort of American national global internet. And that being the case, I think even in those places, you'll probably see a separate internet, a kind of series of intranets rather than a singular internet with some internet connection between them. Let's see. How do you understand blockchain to be different from a public database? Well, I would point out here that, again, I'm not a tech guy. To use the old refrain, this is more of a Kukio question. I don't know that much about tech issues like blockchain and whatnot. My understanding of blockchain is that it is, or at least it can be used as itself a kind of public database. So in a sense, there's not really much difference. But I myself don't really know that much about public databases in the first place, so I can't really tell you what the differences would be. So I would refer you to people in chat. I know we've got some people with a tech background in chat, so maybe they could kind of elaborate on that, or correct me if I'm wrong. That certainly wouldn't surprise me. And yeah, I can't really add too much to that because I don't know enough about public databases, blockchain technology, etc., etc. So let's see, that's the last of the questions.
We may
A
have
couple of things.
one more.
Sorry.
I said we can take one more question, if that's cool with you.
Oh, we don't have any more.
No, I was saying that we will accept one additional question.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, talking to the question gatherer.
Sorry, you asked me a question while I was out of the room and Batman was in my stead.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
Let's see. There was a couple of things I wanted to touch on real quick. Let's see. So I don't know if Mass Neotech is still listening, but I did see his comment from last week in which he disputed my assertion that Bulgaria, communist Bulgaria specifically during the Cold War, did not have civil society. And I wasn't sure what his argumentation was on that, his counter-argument. I was wondering if maybe he thought I was trying to say that Bulgaria did not have, that Bulgarian society did not have civility, and that's not what I meant. I'm not sure if maybe that was the confusion or not. You can kind of get back to me on that. But civil society just refers to institutions outside of government. Basically civilian institutions that are, NGOs, independent think tanks, religious institutions, things like that. Things that are just not controlled by the government. And in communist Bulgaria, the Communist Party, like a lot of communist parties, pretty much controlled everything. There really was not any institution that was not either directly or indirectly controlled by the party. And that's why I say that that's why I said that communist Bulgaria did not have civil society, or did not have strong civil society. That was something that had to wait until the opening after the Communist Party lost power, when Bulgaria democratized, and at which point there was finally some space in which civil society institutions could emerge. So I'm not saying that Bulgaria was not civil or lacked civility, or that they are just uncivilized uncivilized barbarians or anything like that. I was just commenting on civil society institutions. So hopefully that was, I'm getting at the crux of the issue. If not, if there's some other counter argument, I would love to hear it because I'm interested. You piqued my interest. So if not in chat, you can tap my email. Anybody who wants to comment on any of this stuff, feel free to use my email. It's the johntx1848@gmail.com. So that's open for that. I created it specifically for that purpose, so feel free. Feedback is appreciated, so anything anybody wants to send is appreciated. Let's see. So then there was somebody asked about the political status of Romania. I don't know a whole lot about Romanian politics. I know that the only thing I remembered off the top of my head is that they tried to legalize a certain amount of bribery, which kind of speaks to the which kind of speaks to the role of corruption in Romanian political culture. Romania is a prototypical example of a former communist state kind of struggling to modernize its political culture, trying to get over that legacy of communist influence. The political culture under communism was in pretty much every country that had communism was very corrupt and self-serving, and it just created a lot of problems that kind of still resonate even after the Communist Party has lost power. So Romania has a lot of those problems. The example in point, the bribery thing kind of stemmed from concern over anti-corruption legislation that had been passed that created an agency that was dedicated specifically to fighting corruption, and there was kind of a fear that it was being abused and corrupted itself and used as a political bludgeon against people's political enemies. So it was thought that maybe it would be easier to just make a certain amount of bribery below a certain amount legal, so that that anti-corruption agency could not just go around arresting basically everybody, since it's basically everybody in Romania's political institutions kind of does that, takes bribes.
But if we stop corruption, then how will the corrupt people make it by?
Exactly. So that was sort of the crux of the legislation. I don't think that ended up passing, because I think there was a pretty substantial shitstorm over that. Obviously, people were not really keen on having such legislation. If we have anybody from Romania listening, please correct me on any of this that I'm getting wrong. This is really, it's been a long time since I've read about Romanian politics, and I haven't read that much of it. So certainly your input on the matter would be appreciated. But that is my impression, that the country suffers from corruption. I think it's also one of the poorest countries in Europe, so there's also a lot of problems with poverty. I also do remember, though, that they were one of the first parts of Eastern Europe during the Cold War to really develop a tech sector. I seem to remember Romania producing a lot of programmers. I don't know if that's still true, but I think I remember reading about that. They had something of a computer science industry there that popped up pretty earlier than other countries in the region. But still relatively poor, problems with political corruption. That is pretty much my reading on the political status of Romania. I haven't followed enough of the recent politics to know who's in power or kind of what they're doing there. I vaguely remember, I think the socialists won power. That would just be a guess, though. I'm not even sure. You know, if you're Romanian and listening, please please put in chat who's running Romania right now, because I don't remember quite off the top of my head. Let's see. So there was that. Somebody was asking about military exercises in LA. I kind of just assumed that it had something to do with the Trump administration sending troops to the border. That's actually not true. Apparently, that was a separate military exercise held by special forces. They were training in urban combat. And apparently, it's relatively unusual for them to actually have exercises in downtown areas like that late at night, but apparently they do it with relative frequency. I know that sounds contradictory. It's unusual in that they don't do it very often, but it's not atypical in that they do it basically every couple years. So it is relatively regular in that sense. They don't always do it in downtown LA, so you know, sometimes they go to a different city. But yeah, that it is not that uncommon. It is not unheard of, shall we say, that special forces will do urban combat training in a downtown area. That's kind of what was witnessed then. Let's see, Magnitsky Act, Bezos drama. Got a bunch of stuff here we haven't gotten to, but let's skip that. We got to that. I think there was some. Oh, that's what it was. So somebody a couple of weeks ago asked me to comment on Macedonian politics, and they were kind of asserting that the CIA had been behind a lot of the recent unrest. So I'm going to try to blow through it really quickly here. Some of the recent reading. Basically, there was a really heated election in 2014 in Macedonia. The winner was a nationalist party called the VMRO-DPMNE, which is a mouthful. But basically, that's the nationalist party. They defeated the center-left SDSE, which were kind of an ex-communist center-left political party. The SDSE claimed fraud and refused to recognize the legitimacy of the election, and then boycotted parliament. So that created sort of the basis for future tensions. The SDSE started making threats after that about having evidence against the government about certain illegal activities that were going on, so corruption in government basically. And apparently we're trying to use that as leverage to get the government to create a government of national unity in which their party was a part. You know, they tried to create basically a coalition. That didn't work. And so later the government, under the, I'm just going to call them the DPMNE just for short. The DPMNE government under Prime Minister Gruevski, actually that would be even shorter, the Gruevski government, accused the SDSE leaders specifically I think a guy named Zayev, of planning a coup against the government and working with foreign intelligence agents. And he claimed to have documents in which SDSE leaders rather, conspired with the British ambassador to Macedonia. So then that opened up a whole can of worms, because immediately the SDSE responded by alleging that the government had wiretapped 20,000 Macedonians and had covered up the murder of a staffer by a police officer. And they actually produced a lot of evidence of this by producing recordings of Prime Minister Gruevski himself talking with his head of counterintelligence, talking about various ways they were influencing the judiciary and various other somewhat dubious practices. And so early on, immediately after that, Zayev, the leader of the SDSE, had claimed to have gotten those recordings with the help of a foreign country, but he later walked that back. But that kind of tipped his hand a bit about the influence of foreign powers. But anyway, after that, that's kind of where the mass protests come in, because after that exchange of allegations, a lot of anti-government opposition folks who supported the opposition parties hit the streets, and there was a series of mass protests over a long period of time. That's not to say that there were not also pro-government protests. But in general, the anti-government protests were the genesis of the subsequent instability. So EU mediation came in and got the different parties to agree to the Prozino Agreement, in which the opposition politicians would be included in government. They would be given certain positions. Prime Minister Gruevski would have to step down, and there would be early elections for June of 2016. Mind you, all of this occurred over the course of 2014, 2015. And I think this point of mediation where the agreement was made was late 2015. So then there was kind of some stability for a while, but then protests broke out again in 2016, a month before the elections, when the government ended the investigation into the wiretapping scandal. And so at that point, protesters started demanding a technocratic government because they didn't trust it wasn't the Gruevski government anymore, the DPMNE government. And they also demanded the scrapping of elections because they didn't trust the government to oversee free and fair elections. They wanted elections to be delayed so that a technocratic government could oversee them. Ideally, an impartial technocratic government. So let's see, where were we here?
Technocrats.
So then there followed in April EU sanctions on the DPMNE government to add on to the pressure. So then, the month before, so then in addition, the opposition declared that they would boycott the vote. They did so. So then the DPMNE was the only party to register to vote, and the Constitution of Macedonia, I hope I'm right on this, the Constitution of Macedonia says that if you only have one party running in a national election, then you cannot have the election. There has to be more than one party. So the boycott was successful in that the Constitutional Court then ruled that the elections had to be canceled. And the Constitutional Court also suggested that the Parliament change that rule and reschedule the elections for later. Meanwhile, the elections continued. I'm basically reading this from my notes at this point. Later in May, that May 2016, the government began impeachment proceedings against Prime Minister Ivanov of the DPMNE government, and those were, I believe, successful. And then that led into the December elections, which saw a opposition coalition win out. Technically, the DPMNE government actually got the most votes, but they were not able to build a coalition with majority. And so the coalition ended up being built out of the SADSC, whatever it was, the socialists, basically. And Zayev became the prime minister. I think they built a coalition with the largest Albanian political party. The Albanians are like the largest ethnic minority in Macedonia, next to the actual ethnic Macedonians themselves. SDSC, that's what it was. So the SDSC government reopened the investigation into the wiretapping scandal, which in turn led to charges, arrests, and the imprisonment of a number of former government officials that had been a part of the previous DPMNE government, including eventually Gruevski himself, which led to his eventual arrest, and eventually he was set to go to prison before he basically escaped the country last month, I think. He ran away to Hungary. He had said that there were threats that he would be killed in prison if he did eventually go to prison. So that's why he justified running away, escaping basically to Hungary. So he's hiding out in Hungary, and there's a big investigation now about how he managed to escape, because he had to cross a number of borders, not just Hungary's, to get out. And there's also another investigation into a new wiretapping scandal, because apparently a bunch of public prosecutors had their offices bugged. So now people are looking into that as well. So basically, a lot of problems, a lot of major issues. The wiretapping scandal was a massive deal, and it hasn't really completely unwound yet. So the question that was kind of brought up, the question that arises is, to what degree are foreign intelligence agencies involved? Well, it seems pretty clear that the SDSE kind of got those recordings from a foreign intelligence agency. I doubt they would have gotten them themselves, and I don't think the intelligence agency in Macedonia would have given them to them. So probably somebody, some outside power did. I don't really know who. Probably the GCHQ was involved. That's sort of the British Signals Intelligence Agency. They're the ones who kind of gather a lot of data and kind of sift through it. But I don't know that the UK itself would be really all that interested in managing that. Would be really all that interested in really interfering in Macedonian affairs for its own sake. I don't think it was the CIA either, because in general, the big complaint within U.S. foreign policy circles over the past 10 years is that the U.S. hasn't been doing anything in the Balkans. So that kind of leads me to suspect that the CIA is kind of overlooking the Balkans and Balkans issues and focusing on other priorities. And in general, I think the attitude in the U.S. government is that the Balkans is more Europe's responsibility. You kind of saw that with the Balkans wars back in the 90s. The Europeans kind of asked the U.S. to intervene and help them deal with the Bosnian Civil War, but the attitude in Washington was that it's in your backyard, you deal with it, you shouldn't need our help with that. And of course, the U.S. ended up getting dragged in anyway, but that just illustrates the attitude in Washington. Balkans issues are Europe's problem first, America's problem second, if that. So I suspect probably more what happened is that the British kind of got some signals intelligence about the wiretapping. I'm assuming it did happen. I think we can at least agree on that. And then passed that information along to France, German governments, maybe the European Union as a whole, and kind of negotiated a course of action. Which then begs the question of why Europe as a whole would really be interested in Macedonia in the first place. I think there might be a couple of reasons. It might have had to do with growing concerns in 2014 and subsequent years about growing illiberalism in Eastern Europe. There had kind of been a trend towards less democracy and less liberal democracy, shall we say, in Eastern Europe over that time span. And there were also growing concerns about Russian influence in that process. So not just growing illiberalism, but also growing Russian influence. So that might be part of the reason they interfered. And it might also be that there were concerns, well, specifically feeding into that, there were concerns about Gruevski himself and his government, just the way he treated the media in Macedonia, his influence on the judiciary, his general attitude, I shouldn't say him specifically, but his government's general attitude to government transparency and corruption. And all of that was not unusual for a former communist country, but he seemed to be kind of going in a negative direction. And it kind of disconcerted Europe because of that overarching trend of illiberalism and Russian influence. They may have decided to act on that in order to try to forestall any further deterioration in that vein. Also, the DPMNE had kind of become more anti-Western with time. I'm not from Macedonia, so I'm not really sure on the time frame on that. Apparently, they had originally been relatively pro-Western, but then became more anti-Western. That's what I read. If we have anybody from Macedonia listening, maybe they can kind of elaborate on when that shift started to happen and how it's relevant to the wiretapping issue. But in general, that's kind of my perspective. I'm guessing Europe got involved because it didn't want further illiberalism in the Balkans, because they see that in their interest. So that's a relatively quick reading of recent Macedonian politics and kind of some interpretation, if you like.
So we close questions,
Sorry,
but
what?
You can carry on as you reach a stopping point.
Gotcha.
I'm going to keep streaming after this, so it's mainly like your and Fuzzy Core's energy.
Oh, okay. Gotcha. All right. So I did want to ask if we did have those Macedonian listeners here. probably not, since it's like 9 a.m. over there, but if they do eventually see this, I did want to ask what they thought about who would win the presidential elections in May. The presidential elections are upcoming in Macedonia, but I haven't really heard anything about them, so I'm curious what anybody from Macedonia might think about that. Who's ahead in the polls, who's winning, who's likely to win, that kind of thing. And how they feel about it. Obviously their own perspective would be useful as well. Let's see. Yeah, I wanted to get to that too. We had a question. What do you think of the conflict between India and Pakistan ongoing in Kashmir? It's not really ongoing. It's kind of a frozen conflict. Periodically, something will blow up in Kashmir, and India will blame Pakistan for it, and then they just kind of ditch at each other for a couple months, and then it goes away. So that's kind of my perception there. More recently, there was a more serious incident in which I think about 40 Indian troops, were killed in a suicide bombing, I think, in Kashmir. And that was a pretty serious escalation. It had been there had been significant protests and some low-intensity conflict. But that was a particularly violent episode, and so a lot of people in India are very upset about that and are demanding the Modi administration take forceful action. The last time something like that happened, they ended up staging a cross-border raid into Pakistan, but it may or may not have actually happened, so it's not really clear how substantive that was. So they may have some further security theater in that vein to try to appease all of the angry Indian nationalists. So you might see a quote-unquote incident in the next couple weeks on the border between India and Pakistan, but it might be a bit ambiguous and might not really amount to anything substantive. So I don't expect it to go anywhere. It has the potential to escalate out of control, into an escalatory spiral that results in a general conflict, but it's relatively unlikely. I think everybody knows that would end badly, given that both India and Pakistan have nuclear weapons. So I suspect India will retaliate in some fashion, but that it won't be really significant enough to warrant an escalatory spiral. Beyond that, you could comment on Kashmir politics and whatnot, but that's like a whole other conversation. Right now it's just stuck. It's just Pakistan thinks it belongs to them, India thinks it belongs to them, and nobody's really willing to negotiate on any of that, give any ground on that. So for now, it's just sort of where it is. I think a big problem, really, and one of the things that really feeds militancy in Kashmir is the disproportionately huge presence of the Indian military in Kashmir. Kashmiris basically live under a state of emergency. They basically live in a de facto police state because the military has broad powers to operate freely in Kashmir to counter the insurgency there. And so that, I think, really feeds the insurgency and makes things worse than they would otherwise be. It probably helped to tone down the military's presence there and to kind of reduce the scope of their powers. I understand that there is problems with rebels there, that are probably supported by the Pakistanis to some degree. But I think that could be handled more deftly and with more finesse than it has been over the past half century. And I think doing so would go a long way towards easing the violence in the region. Let's see, and then the next question was, John Jacques Rousseau in The Social Contract stated that once a state is defeated and the weapons are laid down, that the people of that country are not liable for the actions of their state. Do you believe that this should always be the case, or do you believe that there are exceptions? I don't think it's always going to be the case, because I think it's always going to be subjective. Specifically, I think the degree to which people can or should be held liable for the actions of their government is always going to be subjective and vary from person to person and country to country. So regardless of how true it might be philosophically, in practice it's always going to vary. It's just going to depend on the context. I think after World War II, the general attitude towards the Germans and Japanese was pretty negative, suffice to say. I don't think that's a stretch. So in that case, obviously, there was a sense that maybe they should bear more responsibility for the actions of their state. So I think future examples like that would probably reflect the context in which those circumstances had arisen. If you are in a position where you can hold the people of a country responsible for the actions of their government, whether you conquered that country outright in retaliation, or whether you just have some other point of leverage, or whether you're just having a philosophical debate in a cafe, whatever the context may be, will probably have the most relevance to what you ultimately end up deciding.
Cafe context.
Okay. So then real quick, I'll try to pump these out as well.
All right.
Taxes, at any time you want me to kind of cut this short so that you can kind of get on with normal programming, just let me know.
You're good.
Okay, and then the taxes question from last time, I think Fuzzy Cord asked about kind of some of the assertions that have been made in the debate about the 70% top tax rate in the US. And he was asking for some verification on some claims he'd heard, so I kind of looked more into that. Let's see. So the highest income earners in the US, so the highest amount, the proportion of their income that the top 1% of income earners in the US have ever paid, the total effective tax rate that they have ever paid was 40% of income. And that was in, I want to say, the 1940s, I think is what I read. So even though the tax rate was very high, much higher then than it is now, I think it peaked at like 90% at one point during World War II, the effective tax rate was actually just about 40%. It didn't actually go anywhere near that 90% level or the 70% level that it was later. And that had to do with loopholes, deductions, and exceptions, of which there were quite a few. So then that brings us to the next point that was asked about. Did Ronald Reagan and his administration close a lot of those loopholes, deductions, and exceptions? So he did close a lot of those, but I don't know enough about that to know how many were closed and how substantive they were in terms of being effective, being significantly impactful. They were impactful in so much as they helped raise a significant amount of tax revenue, but I don't know enough about them, again, to know whether or not, for example, they would be enough, the closing of those loopholes would be enough now to increase the effective tax rate if you were to jerk up tax rates to like 70, 90% again. Just as a side note, he actually increased tax revenue in a lot of different ways. He made it tougher to evade taxes. He broadened the tax base, including reducing various federal tax breaks and closing tax loopholes. He accelerated an increase in the payroll tax rate. He required that higher income beneficiaries pay income tax on part of their benefits. He required that you required the self-employed to pay the full payroll tax rate, which they hadn't really been required to do before, rather than just pay a portion normally paid by employees. So those were all different ways that the Reagan administration actually increased tax revenue. He also lowered the tax rate. There were tax cuts, but those were kind of balanced out to a degree with a lot of these closing of loopholes and whatnot. So perhaps more relevant to the question then of what the effective tax rates would actually be is Hauser's law, which states that, and it's debatable whether or not this is an actual law, it may just be more of an observation, but Hauser noted that tax collection over the course of U.S. history never resulted in tax revenues that fell outside of a specific band, 14 to 22% of GDP. So no matter how high or low probably more high, no matter how high a tax rate's got, tax revenue never really breached 22% of GDP. So that implies, you could interpret that to imply that raising tax rates higher and higher isn't going to matter, because it's either people will use loopholes, or if you close those loopholes, economic activity will reduce in response, such that tax revenue kind of flattens. So it never really can breach 22% of GDP. On the other hand, you could argue that, and it has apparently been argued, that this phenomena is purely an observation. It's kind of a political artifact. And that if you actually did increase the tax rate, close loopholes, etc., maybe you could breach 22% of GDP. It would just kind of be a matter of how you did it. And it may be that the only reason that band had never been breached before was because of political activity creating loopholes in response to higher tax rates, as part of kind of an organic process. So, whenever tax rates went up, there was kind of a countervailing creation of exemptions, and whenever they went down, there was a countervailing closing of loopholes, such that you ended up with a pretty consistent tax revenue as percentage of GDP. That's a debate. I haven't read too much into that, though, so I can't comment too much on that, but I did kind of want to return to that topic I think it was Fuzzy Cord, to try to elaborate on some of those points. The effective tax rate was about 40%. That's true. The Reagan administration did close a lot of loopholes and probably did so to the degree that if you did increase tax rates to 70%, that the effective tax rate would be higher this time, higher than it was the last time tax rates were at 70%. But the thing is, again, I don't know enough about the Reagan administration. I don't know enough about the loopholes that were closed under the Reagan administration to know if they were substantive enough to significantly increase effective tax rates if you did return to the 70% tax rate. So I just wanted to make that clear. I haven't been able to do enough reading and exploration on that to really make a clear, succinct statement that says, yes, definitely they would be a lot higher. That is to say, definitely effective tax rates would definitely be a lot higher now than they would have been before. Let's see. So I wanted to clear that up. Somebody was asking, do people in Puerto Rico pay federal income taxes? I don't remember if the question was federal income taxes or federal taxes. Most Puerto Ricans, I went back and tried to read more about it. Most Puerto Ricans don't have to pay federal income taxes, but some do. Apparently, if you're a Puerto Rican citizen, you do have to pay federal income taxes if you're working for the federal government or if you have an income sourced from outside Puerto Rico. Other than that narrow group, nobody else has to pay federal income taxes. So for the most part, the vast majority of people don't. That said, they do have to pay some other federal taxes, including payroll taxes, because Puerto Rican citizens are actually eligible for Social Security. They also pay import and export taxes, federal commodity taxes, and a couple others that were non-disclosed, because I got that from Wikipedia, so take it from what it's worth. So basically, the answer to the question is some. Okay, and then, right, there was also, I'll save that for next time. Somebody was asking about the Malpass nomination to the bank, and I didn't read too much into that. I had not read too much into that at the time. From what I've read about it since then, I still don't think it's really substantive. It's probably not going to be too big a deal, but I can kind of get into the specifics on that next time. The other thing was Article 11 and 13 in the European Union. Somebody was asking about that as well. Again, I was wrong on that. I said that vote on that was going to be, I predicted that the vote on that was going to be delayed, and instead it's been pulled up. There was a compromise agreement between France and Germany. Let me see. Oh, wait, let me kind of walk that back a little bit. Specifically, there had been disagreement between the EU Council and EU Parliament and EU Commission on different versions of the bill. Those all had to be reconciled. And then kind of at the last minute, there was a compromise between France and Germany that facilitated that reconciliation. The Germans kind of wanted to make an exception for small firms because they didn't think it was reasonable to impose the bill's restrictions on them because of the cost of adhering to those restrictions. France was opposed to that. So the compromise they reached is that only tech companies with fewer than 5 million monthly users and an annual turnover of under 10 million euros will be exempt. So there is an exemption, but it's a pretty, well, it's not necessarily narrowly defined, but it is a specific group. Less than 5 million users monthly and less than 10 million euros revenue. Those companies will be exempt. Everybody else will be subject to the new rules if they are, in fact, eventually passed. Apparently, Italy, Finland, Sweden, and Slovakia were opposed to that, but eventually kind of were overcome. So it may be that those countries are sources of future opposition and resistance. So you might keep an eye on them. But for the moment, there is nominally reconciliation, and it looks like the bill is going to move forward. The European Union Parliament still has to vote on it, so it could still get voted down. They'll be voting on the final version, the final reconciled version. And it may be that there's enough political tension from the upcoming European Union Parliament elections, in which populists are expected to do relatively well, that some of the establishment parties that are supporting the bill might blanch a bit and kind of walk that back and vote against it. That's pure speculation, though, and it probably will get passed, though. That would be kind of my nominal prediction. It's supported by the biggest parties and coalitions, kind of both left and right, and most of the opposition parties are kind of either populist parties or kind of marginal parties. So I don't know that there's going to be enough support regardless. But there has been opposition growing with time. There's a journalist group that had supported it, but that kind of changed their mind because they didn't think it would actually help improve journalists' their compensation, basically. So more groups have kind of come out against it over time, and it might be that by the time there is an actual vote, there might be enough pressure to kind of see it fail. But again, I don't predict that. It seems like the consensus is that it's going to pass Parliament. So I wanted to update people on that. As a side note, the actual law itself is called the Directive on Copyright and Digital Single Market in the Digital Single Market. And Articles 11 and 13 are basically components of that law. So the actual law itself actually does some things that are useful. It's not purely a power play for intellectual property holders. Some of the other items addressed by the bill include copyright exception for test and data mining for the purposes of scientific research. That doesn't really exist right now, so that would actually be an improvement. Mandatory exception for the use of copyrighted works as part of a quote-unquote digital and cross-border teaching act, as part of digital and cross-border teaching, basically education. It kind of allows an exception to the copyright rules for if you're using them for educational purposes. It proposes granting sports events organizers copyright over recordings of their events. We already kind of have that in the US, so that's not a surprise. Allows authors to increase their remuneration in some cases where it is disproportionately low. That's a little subjective, but again, no surprise given that the bill is nominally designed to empower content creators. It attempts to clarify the legal status of certain common activities by libraries and of orphan works. That's kind of public domain type stuff. Article 13 also itself includes exceptions for nonprofit online encyclopedias, basically Wikipedia, open source software development platforms, cloud storage services, online marketplaces, and communication services. So Article 13 is not going to be applicable to everybody. And even the people it is specifically applicable to will have some exceptions, as I kind of outlined earlier. So it's not going to be a blanket rule. Also, the revised, reconciled Article 13 is a little bit more lenient. It says that services must make quote-unquote best efforts to remove copyright protected videos in cases where quote-unquote the rights holders have provided the relevant and necessary information, end quote. So maybe the sites can, given that wording, it may be that sites can actually lean on the existing reporting system, where you basically just act on reports of copyright violations without having to pay for it, implement a really expensive set of filtering system. So long as you're making a legitimate effort to respond to reports, and you're making quote-unquote best efforts to remove them after you receive those reports, it may be that you'll still be in compliance with them. Now, I'm not a lawyer. I don't have a strong legal background, so I don't know how accurate that reading actually is, but nominally, that is a possibility. It may be that the legal stringency, that's not a word, it may be that the bill has been watered down sufficiently to make it less draconian than it had been in some of its earlier stages. So then as a final note, I wanted to touch on a little bit on the impact on Twitch, because I know that was kind of relevant to you specifically, Neuro. I read a letter from December, and you probably read it yourself, from Twitch that kind of commented on the possible effects of Article 13. And from what I read in the letter, it seems like Twitch would, in the event the bill passed, segregate European content from the rest of their from the other content produced in other regions, such that the filtering would be applied, but only applied to European Union producers. In which case, you would be fine, for example, or anybody outside the EU. The filters would apparently can be segregated according to region, and it seems like Twitch would use that model if it came to it.
Yeah, but it would be bad for the friends who are from Europe.
Yeah.
Lots of content creators, people from Netherlands, Germany, England, all over.
Mm-hmm. It would definitely impact them, but again, it's not entirely clear how much impact it would actually have given the wording of the bill and some of the negotiation that have gone on. So again, it kind of depends on implementation. Something else to keep in mind, I think I actually skipped this earlier. If the bill does pass, and again, I think it will, the actual implementation of the bill is going to depend on interpretation and legal implementation by individual countries. So individual countries will actually have to pass their own laws to implement this law that Articles 11 and 13 are a part of. And given how much difference in opinion there are in different countries, it could well be that countries water down their version of the law significantly, such that some of the worst concerns are kind of appeased. Like I said earlier, those 4 countries I mentioned, Slovakia, Finland, Sweden, and Italy, are examples of countries that kind of opposed were sources of opposition early in the early going, they could well water down the bill, their versions of the bill significantly, or even not pass the bill at all. They could basically just not address this. That would probably create a bit of a political issue in the European Union, but hypothetically, that is possible. So it's not that the European Union is passing this bill for everybody and it's going to go into effect right away and have effects all over Europe. This is the start of a process in which the European Union member states would have to actually then go on and implement the ruling in their own way and on their own terms. And again, those terms could well vary in the degree of severity and the degree in terms of how strictly they actually enforce the provisions of the rule. So that's also another source of hope for those who are really concerned about this. So I think that pretty much covers a lot of the stuff that I wanted to get to. I had a lot of unanswered questions basically from last time that I wanted to get to, which is why I'm kind of trying to blow through these here at the end. I did want to kind of give a more satisfactory set of answers than I gave last time. So I think that should do it. I think that's enough for tonight.
Sweet.
If that's okay.
Yeah, that's fine. I mean, I have lots of energy. I took some extra rest time because the stream yesterday went for about 13 and a half hours. So it was a big promoted one, so you always want to get as much value from that as you can. But yeah. I also celebrated, had a little bit of wine, had a little bit too much wine, so I had to recover the earlier part of today.
Gotcha.
Shaking it off and feeling good. I actually won the last 7 games in a row while we've been on.
Oh, nice. Well done, sir.
Yeah. Yeah, but it's good content. Good having you on. Are we on a 3-week streak now?
We are.
That's incredible.
Yeah, it's good to have a little rhythm.
Yeah, thanks Fuzzy Cord for stepping up for that. Moss said there was a real life thing that came up, which happens.
No problem. Yeah, yep. Much appreciated for the assistance, Fuzzy Cord and Mass Neotech.
Yep, and all the nice people in chat asking questions. We do have quite a few new people who are like, "What's this?" So welcome. Nice viewership through the segment. We were between 800 and 1,000 for most of it.
Oh, nice.
You famous now, dude. Just wait. Someone's gonna... They haven't seen you, but maybe you're somewhere and you're getting food, and they recognize your voice, and they're like, "What? Are you Agent Smith?" And you're like, "What? No."
Well, it's probably for the best that they don't. I think they would be disappointed. I'm not exactly a model physique.
You can spin whatever narrative you want if you're anonymous.
That's true.
I look like a Greek god. But I'm even stronger.
Not that healthy. You could roll me down the street as I am now.
Well, thanks for coming on. This is episode 47. It'll be highlighted and should be on YouTube pretty soon. And we will see you in the next one, Mr. Agent Smith.
Yep, thank you very much. See you next time.
GG. Sweet.